I had carried Serena's pack for 6 years, and I was still carrying it the night she decided I was finished. We were deep in the Neezer dungeon on a job to thin the beast numbers and figure out why the old seal at its heart had started to weaken. I did what I always did on jobs like that. I hauled the tents, the rope, the spare blades, the rations nobody else wanted to carry, and I said nothing when Victor complained that I walked too slowly, the way he always did, like my pace was a personal insult to him. Nathan had stopped bothering to complain out loud months ago. He just muttered things to no one about how the guild's coin stretched far enough to keep a porter fed and not much further. She was the reason I'd stayed this long. When we were children in the same border village, she was the one who stood between me and boys twice my size before anyone called her the Flower Sword Saint or gave her a guild to run. I had built 6 years of loyalty on the memory of that one afternoon. It hadn't occurred to me until the blade was already in that the girl who protected me and the woman who employed me might have wanted two very different things from keeping me close. We stopped where the corridor opened onto a pit that dropped past anywhere a torch could reach. The scouts said it connected to the far side of the dungeon if a person survived the drop. Nobody had tried. Serena told me to set the packs down. I did. She told me to stand at the edge and look because she wanted to show me something. 6 years of doing what she asked without asking why made that part easy too. She stepped close, the way she used to when we were children, and she was checking a scrape on my knee. The blade went into my side before I understood it wasn't concern. Then hands were on my back. Victor's, maybe Nathan's. It didn't matter whose. And the edge of the pit was gone, and so was the floor, and Serena was still watching me the whole way down. The torchlight above shrank to a coin, then to nothing. I fell longer than a fall should take, long enough to feel the wound in my side turn from pain into something colder, long enough to wonder, almost calmly, why no one had come to check that it had worked. The air screamed past my ears until even that stopped meaning anything. I didn't pray. I only thought, stupidly, that dying should hurt more than this. Then, my hand caught on something solid in the dark that had no business being there. A slab of stone hanging in open air, lit by no source I could name, words cut into its face. I read it once before everything went out. For the burden, a garden's blessing. For the bastard, hell's pain and death. I didn't get the chance to decide which one I was. Then the fall ended, and so did I. I woke on sand that felt more like packed sugar than sand. Under a sky a shade too blue to be real, with a fresh scar across my stomach where the wound should have still been open. The sea in front of me broke in perfect square increments, like someone had built the ocean out of blocks and never smoothed the edges. A voice reached me from the tree line before I saw who owned it. "You're staring at the water like it owes you money." I turned. A man crouched there in a wrinkled shirt with his tie hanging loose around his neck like he'd given up on it hours ago, stubble climbing halfway up his jaw. He didn't look like a god. He looked like a man who'd missed his last 2 performance reviews. He crouched lower, elbows on his knees, unbothered by the fact that I was clearly deciding whether to run. "You're dead, or you were. I'm the one who pulled you through the gate at the bottom of that pit before the Nether finished processing you. Name's Hector." I asked him why. Because I reminded him of himself, he said. He had been a burden once too, in his own company, long before anyone called him a creator god or a devil or any of the other names the world had hung on him since. Nobody ever liked the one who carried things for them, he said, until the day the carrying stopped. He told me the custom allowed me 3 questions and that he was bored enough to enjoy watching me choose them. I asked if I could be resurrected. Already had been, he said. I just hadn't finished feeling it yet. I asked why he'd bothered saving me instead of letting the Nether have me, and got the same answer dressed differently. He liked watching burdens stop being burdens. The 3rd question, I didn't need to think about. I asked if he'd give me the power to make the people who threw me away regret it. He grinned with every tooth he had. "That's exactly why I called you here." Then he told me what he actually was. Not a tired man in a bad tie, but the creator god, the world now called the reincarnation devil, the one who had built this island and the one behind it, out of nothing but boxes. His creation had turned into a cancer, he said, and he wanted someone with a reason to cut it down. He was giving me Hakoniwa, the box garden. Every object I touched could fold into a cube, carried, stacked, thrown, broken apart, rebuilt. The weight would lie to everyone but me. He nudged a chunk of the box-edged coral at his feet toward me with one boot. I picked it up without thinking. It weighed nothing, no more than a folded shirt, even though it was the size of a boulder. He told me to imagine dropping it on someone who hadn't been given the same permission. I didn't have to imagine hard. "Can I take anything?" "Anything," he said. "Any material thing in this world or the one you're going back to. That's the whole garden." "I understand," I said. "Enough to know exactly what I'm going to do with it." The next thing I knew, I was back at the bottom of the pit, the stone slab and its inscription gone, my side aching where the scar remembered being a wound. Hector hadn't said goodbye. Gods like that never do. I didn't waste time wondering if any of it had been real. I pressed my hand against the rubble under my knees, and it folded into a block the size of a fist, weightless, humming faintly, obedient. I made another, then another. I stacked them beneath my feet, one at a time, and started climbing. It was slow work. Each block only rose as high as my knee before I needed a fresh one underneath it, and my side screamed with every reach. I didn't stop. I didn't know yet what else this power could do. Right now, it only needed to do one thing: get a dead man out of a hole, using the same walls that had tried to keep him in it. Serena had smiled when she let go. I was going to be thinking about that for a long time. 2 days, maybe less. Down in that shaft, time was whatever the torch said it was, and the torch had never been the talkative type. I climbed on blocks I built myself, same as before, except now I understood less about how far the rest of this power might reach. Hector had told me to test it, which from him meant figure it out yourself, and try not to die again doing it. So I closed my eyes and counted to 5, out of nothing better to do, while a fresh block cooled under my palm. A white square opened behind my eyelids, 9 slots, laid out 3 across and 3 down, one of them already glowing with the shape of a torch. I reached into that light and pulled a real one out, flame lit and warm in my fist, before I understood what I'd done. I nearly dropped it. Hector laughed at me from somewhere that wasn't anywhere. "You're surprised by an item slot? That's just the loose change of this power." "Then what's the actual coin?" I said. "Touch the wall. Right hand. Do it like you mean it." I didn't mean it. Not the first time. My head was still on the woman who used to look at me like I was furniture that had started talking back. The coldest eyes I'd ever seen, right before she pushed me down a different hole entirely, months before this one. Thinking about Helena stalled my hand against the stone like it belonged to someone else. "You're doing the thing with your face again," Hector said. "Stop remembering and start touching." I put my hand flat against the wall and thought about nothing except getting out. The rock cracked in a neat square around my palm, rose with a sound like a held breath being let go, and popped free. Light as a hollowed gourd, heavy as a mountain to anyone who wasn't me. I stacked it under my boots and kept climbing. The wound in my side hadn't fully closed, whatever Hector's realm had done to patch it. Every stretch to set a fresh block under my palm pulled at the same spot, a dull reminder that dying doesn't necessarily mean healing. I stopped counting how many blocks I'd made somewhere around the second day and started counting how much further the gray patch above me had grown instead. That felt like better math. By the time real light found the shaft, I had a name for what I was doing. Hector called it craft. I called it the only thing standing between me and the bottom of that pit. I came up through the last hole covered in enough dirt that I probably looked like something that had crawled out of a grave and forgotten to lie back down. The chamber above wasn't natural. Carved pillars, worked stone, veins of pale ore running through the walls that gave off their own weak light. Somebody had built this place a long time before I fell into it. "Neat, right?" Hector said. "I made this world a few thousand years back. Humans got busy with it while I wasn't looking." I asked him, mostly to hear myself say it out loud, whether any of what he'd given me was good for more than moving furniture. He didn't answer. The air changed instead. Shapes rose out of the dark edges of the chamber, gray, slack-jawed, more of them than I could count in the time it took to notice the first one. They kept coming until I was ringed by better than 100, shuffling closer with no hurry at all, like they already knew how this ended. They didn't have faces worth the word anymore. Gray skin gone slack over old bone, mouths hanging open around a hunger that wasn't for food. Whatever they'd once wanted, all that remained was an appetite for mana, and mine apparently smelled like dinner. Nobody else's hands could lift what I'd built. To them, my blocks were only heavy stone. I already had one sitting in my item slot from an hour back, door-sized, dense, mine to throw, and nobody else's to catch. I threw it into the thickest part of the crowd. It went through them the way a fist goes through wet paper. Whatever was left of the front rows simply weren't standing anymore, and the ones behind them didn't have room to be anything but flat too. I laughed, loud, and a little too long. I had spent years carrying things too heavy for me, and being told to be grateful for the privilege. Something about that laugh felt like a debt finally starting to collect interest. "That was the door," Hector said, sounding pleased with himself for once. "The old builders called this whole ruin the fortress. What you just met was the welcome mat." He told me the rest of it went down, not up. Floors built to kill anything that hadn't earned the right to keep breathing. I asked what happened to anything that didn't earn it. "You already know the answer to that one, baggage carrier. You already died once." That at least I could work with. I knew what waited on the other side of dying now. A walk on Hector's cube-shaped beach, a shove back through the gate. No worse for it, except whatever I'd been carrying when it happened. I had nothing left worth losing. Serena's people had already made sure of that, so I went down. I don't remember the first death clearly. Something with too many teeth, a mistake in timing, the ground gone out from under me before I understood the shape of the danger. I remember opening my eyes on the beach a breath later, Hector not even looking up from whatever he was doing, and going straight back through the gate to try again. Death 7 taught me the teeth thing preferred my left side. Death 23 taught me the floor past the third bend liked to open beneath weight it didn't recognize as friendly. Death 41 taught me some of what lived down there, hunted by sound, not sight, which meant silence bought more time than speed ever would. Each one cost me nothing I hadn't already decided I could live without, and each one left me knowing the fortress a little better than the death before it. Hector, for his part, treated my count like a scoreboard. Death 440 was a personal best, he told me once, entirely too pleased with himself. You lasted almost 6 minutes. I didn't dignify that with anything but going back through the gate one more time. I stopped flinching around death 30. I stopped counting for a while after death 200, then started again out of habit somewhere past 600, because a man needs a number to hold on to when he stopped having anything else. By then, my hands didn't shake before a fight anymore. They just moved. I'd stopped rehearsing what I'd say if I ever stood in front of Serena again. The rehearsal had turned into muscle memory somewhere in the count, and muscle memory doesn't need words. I want to be honest about what that year did to me. It didn't make me brave. It made the words stop meaning anything. Between deaths, when the fortress let me rest, I built. I built because it was the only thing that felt like mine instead of something done to me. A stone shelter first, 4 walls, and a roof boxed whole from the passage above. Then a second one with an iron door pried from somewhere I'd stopped asking Hector about. Then a workshop, because by then I'd learned there was more to this power than lifting and throwing. Boxing turned any object I touched into a block. Throwing turned any block I already held into a cannonball that only respected my hand's claim on it. A third trick showed itself the day a stray spell, some old ward still firing off in the fortress's deep end, came at me faster than I could dodge. I boxed it out of the air instead, held it, threw it back the way it came. Monocraft. Hector sounded almost proud of himself. Didn't expect you to find that one so soon. I didn't expect a spell to try to kill me so soon either, I said. We're both learning things today. Hector asked once what my people meant by magic beast, an odd question for someone who claimed to have built the place. I told him it just meant anything that ran on mana instead of blood. He went quiet after that in a way that felt less like losing interest and more like filing the answer away for later. By the time I'd lost count of the months, the workshop had shelves, and the shelves had names for what sat on them. You've been busy, Hector said, sitting on nothing in particular. Since you're clearly not dying today, want to see what the real menu looks like? He opened something new in front of me. Rows of pale half-lit boxes, each one a skill with a price tag, most of them grayed out past reading. One near the bottom carried a number long enough that it stopped meaning anything past the first several digits. I pointed at it without looking away. That one's not happening. Not today, not this year. You want to know why everything's gray? Because the world's been leaving gold on the table for centuries, and nobody's bothered to pick it up. Go collect it. I asked what I could afford right now. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he admitted, almost sheepish for a being who claimed to have built the world, that he'd already gone and taken my savings from home without asking. Every coin I'd earned carrying other people's gear for 6 years, spent before I knew there was anything to spend it on. One box lit up. Inventory. 33 slots by 33. 1,089 of them total. More storage than any merchant guild in the kingdom could offer a client. Put it all in. There wasn't a version of this where I said no. The grid opened in my mind like a second, much larger house. I didn't fill it with anything sentimental. I filled it with fortress relics, black glass, veined ore, splinters of things that didn't exist anywhere outside this ruin. Because somewhere under the anger, I'd already started planning how I meant to walk back into the world. Not empty-handed. Never that again. The trees past the workshop were dark-grained, heavier than any wood had a right to be. I boxed one whole, then broke it down in the inventory into planks, 16 to a trunk, the system calling the wood duskwood once I bothered to check. I still had a block of black glass saved from the very first wall I'd ever cracked open. back before I understood what I was doing. Obsidian, plain and simple, whatever grander name the system wanted to give it. Hector carved a 9x9 grid out of my inventory for the occasion, my capacity dropping from 1,089 slots to an even 1,000. I did the math twice and got a different number both times. Hector shrugged when I mentioned it. Some mysteries weren't worth chasing. Timber and obsidian went into the grid together. What came out was a sword, not a shape I'd drawn, a shape the power had decided on its own, black-bladed, heavier in the hand than it looked, and somehow no burden at all. It didn't weigh anything in my grip, same as every other cube I'd ever pulled from a wall, but it didn't feel like nothing either. Some part of me understood, holding it, that I'd just made the first thing in this world that was entirely mine. I carried it out to the clearing to see what it could do. I swung it once, more out of curiosity than intent. The ground opened along the line of the swing, a gash through packed earth and root, and half a stand of trees, clean through all of it like the blade hadn't noticed the difference between dirt and wood. I stood there with my arm still following through, more frightened of myself in that moment than anything in the fortress had managed in a year of trying. Underneath the fear, though, something else. I won't pretend it wasn't close to joy. Careful with that thing. Hector nodded at the sword like it had personally offended him. Actually, should have mentioned this a while back. You're in survival mode down here. Die now, and you lose everything you're carrying. Restart from nothing. I looked at him for a long moment. You're telling me this now, after a year of dying on purpose. You didn't have anything worth losing then, he said, entirely unbothered. You do now. Try not to die today. It was, I decided, the closest thing to good advice he'd given me since the beginning. I counted the 1,000th death 2 days later, in a corridor I'd mapped so thoroughly I could have walked it blind, which, as it turned out, I very nearly had to. The thing that killed me that time barely slowed me down on the walk back through the gate. The fortress's monsters had spent a year teaching me their patterns by dying to me, instead of the other way around, near the end. I'd stopped losing fights before I'd stopped losing count. I found the door out on my own, without Hector's help. Stone, sealed for longer than the ruin had had a name, and it opened at a touch like it recognized me as something the fortress had finished making. Well, Hector said, from somewhere behind me that was already getting further away. Let me know how it goes. I didn't answer him. There wasn't anything left to say that a year of dying hadn't already said for me. The sun came up ordinary, which felt like an insult after everything underground. I found the stream past the tree line and knelt in it long enough to stop looking like something that belonged in a grave. The water ran brown, then gray, then finally clear around my hands. I laid the sword flat on the bank while I worked the dirt out of what was left of my sleeves, and for one unremarkable minute, I let myself feel like a person again, instead of a number climbing toward 1,000. Then I saw the color in the sky to the south, orange, low and wrong, in a direction that had no business holding a sunrise. I sat back on my heels and watched it for longer than I should have, because some part of me was already doing the math a normal morning shouldn't require. Wrong direction, wrong hour. The only thing south of this tree line was the port. I was on my feet before I'd finished deciding to be. Whatever this year had made of me, it hadn't made me someone who could watch a wrong-colored sky and just keep washing his hands. I picked up the sword and I started walking toward the smoke. The smoke thinned before I reached the first rooftops. By the time I crossed into the market square, the orange I'd seen from the stream had turned into nothing more than breakfast fires over 100 ordinary chimneys, and Port Belgas was just a port again. Carts creaked past, loaded with salted fish and barrels of pitch. Nets dried along the harbor rail. A woman 2 stalls down was shouting a price at a man who wasn't going to pay it, and nobody in that argument had died 1,000 times to get there. I stood in the middle of it, feeling almost foolish. A year underground teaches you to expect the worst color in the sky. It doesn't teach you what to do when the sky turns out to be lying. The town looked exactly like it had before I fell into an abyss a lifetime ago. Same crooked signs, same gulls fighting over fish guts, same noise. I was the only thing in the square that had changed, so I tested something instead. I lifted a crate of oranges off the nearest stall while the owner's back was turned, boxed it down to the size of a coin, and set it back exactly where it had stood before anyone noticed the gap. It came back whole. Nobody looked up. A year of dying to learn that trick, and the first thing I used it for on the surface was theft. I immediately returned. I picked the sword up properly onto my back, pulled my hood forward, and went looking for a place that served something other than dried fish. The tavern near the loading docks was half empty and smelled like tar and yesterday's stew. I took a corner table, ordered whatever was cheapest, and let the room talk without me in it. Two dockhands a few tables over weren't being quiet about their opinions. One of them said Silver Feather had botched its second contract in a month, some escort job that ended with the client's cargo at the bottom of a ravine. The other said the guild's own officers couldn't agree on who was to blame for it, that the meeting after had turned into shouting loud enough to hear through the walls. Used to be the best crest in the country, the first one said, not quite believing it himself. The other one didn't look up from his mug. Still is. On paper. I didn't react. I filed it the way I filed everything now. Flat, no expression. One more fact in a ledger I was keeping without meaning to. Serena's guild was cracking somewhere I couldn't see, a year after they'd thrown away the one person who used to hold the cracks shut. I thought about what Hector would have said about that kind of irony and decided I didn't need him to say it out loud for it to land. Then I finished eating and left before either of them noticed I'd been listening at all. I hadn't gone 40 steps before the second fire found me, a real one this time. Smoke came up black and sudden over the warehouse row, and people were already running the other way, dragging carts and children and armfuls of whatever they'd grabbed first. A support beam somewhere inside the noise groaned and gave, and the crowd's noise jumped an octave. Silver Feather cloaks were there before I was, a loose ring of them at the edge of the flame line, armored, armed, doing nothing but argue among themselves about whose jurisdiction the fire fell under. One of them was gesturing at a ledger, of all things, like the building would wait for a signature. Nobody in that ring had moved a foot closer to the fire in the time it took me to cross the street. That was when I heard the voice. It came from somewhere under a collapsed section of warehouse wall, high and cracking with fear, sounding younger than it had any right to. I didn't wait for Silver Feather to finish deciding whose problem this was. I put my hand on the nearest burning section of wall, said the word, and boxed it away from the sound before the fire could reach it. Then the next section, and the next, clearing a path through timber that had been on fire 2 seconds earlier and was now cool black cubes stacked at my feet. The crowd went quiet behind me. A stranger taking a burning building apart with his bare hands tends to do that. Under the wreckage was a woman, not a child, 19 maybe, thin in a way that had nothing to do with the fire, an iron collar locked around her throat marking her as somebody's property. Her eyes were the first thing that stopped me. One crimson red, one deep navy blue, wide with a fear that hadn't found anywhere to go yet. She had her knees pulled to her chest and her gaze fixed on me with the specific tired look of someone who had already decided hoping was a mistake she wouldn't make twice. "I'm getting you out," I told her. "Don't fight me on it." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I closed my hand around the lock at the back of the collar, boxed it into nothing, and the iron fell away from her neck in 2 clean pieces. She touched the bare skin there like she didn't believe it was gone. I got an arm under her and pulled her clear of the wreck, out past the last of the smoke, into daylight that made her flinch. I didn't ask her name yet. I didn't perform the rescue for the crowd watching, and she didn't perform gratitude for me. She just stayed close, half a step behind my shoulder, the way you stay near the only warm thing in a cold room. She studied me back just as carefully, though in the same instant she was shaking. That kind of quiet assessment doesn't come from someone who has only ever been afraid. Just her breathing was enough to catch something in me off guard. Glad, plain and simple, no complication attached. A year of counting my own deaths, and this was the first time in that whole stretch that somebody else staying alive had mattered to me on its own terms. I put the thought away and started working out how we were going to get clear of Silver Feather before somebody asked me a question I didn't want to answer. That was when the guild noticed me. A broad-shouldered man in steel gray plate pushed through his own soldiers to reach me, and I recognized the walk before I placed the face. Victor, Silver Feather's second blade, the same arrogance riding his shoulders that I remembered from a life I wasn't supposed to have survived. He didn't recognize me back. My face had gone thin over the past year, and the wreckage of that year was written into it in ways a man who'd never really looked at me wouldn't read. He'd never looked at me. Nobody in that guild ever had. He told me I was standing on guild-claimed ground, and that if I didn't give my name and my business, he'd take the sword off my back himself. "Corwin," I said, just passing through. He didn't like the answer. His jaw worked like he was deciding whether passing through counted as an insult, and his hand went for the hilt at his hip to make the point for him, and I boxed the blade out of the scabbard before his fingers closed on the grip. Cube and gone, the leather sheath left empty at his side. Victor stared at the space where his sword should have been for a long moment. The woman beside me forgotten. The fire behind him forgotten. Everything narrowed down to an empty scabbard that made no sense to him. He didn't ask how. He didn't get the chance. I was already turning away, Ellie a step behind me, leaving him to explain the trick to whoever asked him about it later. Serena arrived to manage what Victor couldn't. I knew her before I saw her. The way the street seemed to organize itself around wherever she was about to stand. She came through the press of her own soldiers in white and silver, a single pauldron catching the afternoon light, sword at her hip. The same unreadable calm she'd worn right before she'd shoved me into the abyss. She looked at me. For one beat longer than her composure should have allowed, she looked at me, and something behind her pale green eyes worked at a door that wouldn't quite open. Then she smiled the smile I remembered too well, and thanked the unknown adventurer for his help with the fire. She told her soldiers they were moving on, that the matter was handled, that there was nothing here worth the guild's time. I watched her walk away down a street she'd once told me I didn't belong on. She placed flowers on the body. That was the thought that came up out of nowhere, unbidden, from a story a dead man had told me before he became one. A young man who'd given her flowers once and died for it anyway, and she'd laid the flowers on him afterward like it settled something between them. She placed flowers on the body. I hadn't let myself think about that story in a year. I didn't know why it surfaced now, except that watching her walk away smiling reminded me exactly what a smile from her was worth, and exactly how little that had ever had to do with what she actually felt. Victor caught up to her a few steps later. Neither of them looked back. I left Ellie resting at a room I'd paid for with coin I didn't remember collecting, and climbed the ridge above the port alone to see what else the day had waiting. Below, in the ravine mouth, Serena's party was losing an argument with something that didn't negotiate. A dungeon creature twice the height of the soldiers surrounding it, scaled and patient, already bleeding two of them out on the rock. Serena's sword was fast. It wasn't fast enough to end this before it cost her more people than she'd already lost. I looked at the cliff face under my hand, put my palm flat against 30 tons of stone, and boxed the whole section loose. It came down on the creature like the mountain had decided to end the conversation itself. Dust and rock rolled down into the ravine in a wave loud enough to reach the port behind me. When it cleared, there was no creature left to argue with, just rubble, and Serena's party standing very still, staring up at the ridge where I'd already turned to leave. She asked Victor who that had been. He didn't have an answer for her. Neither of them had one for the second time that day, and I let the question follow me down the far side of the ridge unanswered, which is exactly how I wanted it to stay. A year ago, I would have needed them to know. Now the not knowing felt like the better weapon. I told Ellie we couldn't stay in Port Belgas. Too many people had looked at my face today, and eventually, one of them would look long enough. She didn't ask why. She said she was coming with me. You don't know where I'm going. I kept my eyes on the door, not on her. I know it isn't here, she said, and left it at that. The way she left most things, precise, and just short of whatever she actually meant. I didn't argue. I found, sitting across a lamplit room from a woman who'd had a collar around her neck 12 hours earlier, that I didn't want to argue. That was new enough to notice, and old enough, already, to file away rather than examine. Hector's voice came once more that night, distant, like it was traveling through a wall from the wrong side of it. Told you I'd be curious. Nothing followed it. I called back into the quiet and got nothing back at all. No jokes about my death count, no scoreboard, no complaints about my instincts. A year of a voice showing up uninvited in my head, and now the absence of it sat in the room like furniture somebody had taken away, leaving marks on the floor where it used to stand. He'd given me the only tool I'd ever used against people who never once looked at me twice. I didn't know how to send a thank you into a silence that didn't answer, so I didn't try. After that, I understood the year in the fortress had actually ended. Not when I climbed out of the hole. Now. No voice left to check in with. No safety net waiting on the other side of a bad decision. No free restart if the next mistake cost more than I could afford. Whatever came next was only going to be me, and whoever chose to stand near me while I found out what that meant. I looked at Ellie. She hadn't moved from her spot across the lamp, watching me the way she'd watch a door to see if it was going to open. We left before the town woke up. Ellie walked half a step behind my shoulder again, same as she had since the collapsed wall, like she'd already decided that was her place and wasn't going to ask permission for it twice. Neither of us looked back at the port. There wasn't anything behind us worth the look. A guild that didn't recognize its own ghost. A fire we'd put out with our bare hands. A year that had ended without ceremony in the space of one voice going quiet. Ahead of us, the road ran toward the next city, and I had no plan beyond reaching it. That was fine. Planning past the next step had gotten people I used to know killed for less, and I wasn't in a hurry to repeat their mistake. I adjusted the sword on my back, and we walked into the gray morning together, the harbor going small behind us. The smoke of yesterday already just another thing I'd boxed up and left where it fell. Wallwright came up out of the haze on the 4th day of walking. Walls first, gray stone stacked 3 men high, then rooftops, then the noise. It was bigger than Port Belgas had been, busier, thick with cart traffic, and the smell of a city built on other people's business. Leather, smoke, spoiled fruit, and money changing hands too fast for anyone to weigh it properly. Guards at the gate barely looked at us. 2 travelers with no crest and no coin worth stealing weren't worth the paperwork. The road out from Port Belgas had taken 4 days on foot, longer than it should have, because we stopped every night to build a proper shelter instead of pushing through until we dropped. Habits from the nether die hard, and a roof I'd built myself still felt safer than one I hadn't tested. Ellie had gotten faster at reading which hills hid water and which ones didn't. I'd gotten better at not needing either of us to say when we were tired. I'd gotten her a proper dress somewhere along the way too, out of one of the way station towns, along with boots that actually fit. She never asked for either. She just stopped flinching at the wind where the old shift used to let it through, and I decided that was answer enough. "You keep looking at the walls," she said, "like you're deciding whether to go through them or over them." "Through them's faster," I said. "Over them's quieter. Haven't decided which city this is going to be yet." She didn't smile exactly. Something close to it moved at the corner of her mouth and was gone before I could be sure. 2 days out from the harbor, and she'd already learned the difference between my jokes and my plans. Most people who'd known me a year hadn't managed that. We didn't have names anyone would recognize, papers anyone would honor, or a coin purse anyone would call full. What we had was time, and a city that hadn't decided yet whether to notice us. I intended to spend both carefully. The Adventurers Guild sat 2 streets in from the gate, easy to find by the crowd loitering outside it with nothing better to do. Inside, a clerk with tired eyes and a ledger too thick for the desk it sat on took one look at me, plain clothes, no crest, no party, no references, and reached for the lowest stack of forms without asking a single question. "Solo adventurer then," she said. It wasn't a question either. "Rank F, standard registration fee, non-refundable. Most solo F ranks don't last the season, so I'd recommend finding a party before you take anything above a rat culling job." She slid the card across without looking up again. I signed where she pointed, paid what she asked, and took the card. Rank F, lowest a person could register at, one step above not existing at all on the guild's books. Around us, real F ranks, actual beginners, young and hungry-eyed, watched the exchange with the kind of curiosity people reserve for anything that might be more interesting than their own morning. None of them looked twice at me once the ink dried. That was, more or less, the entire plan working exactly as intended. "That's everything?" I asked. "That's everything." She'd already turned to the next person in line. I pocketed the card. Ellie watched me do it, the way she'd started watching most things I did lately. Not for reassurance, I'd realized, but because she was cataloging me the way I cataloged a dungeon. She'd learned that when I went quiet like this, it wasn't submission, it was arithmetic. "You could have told her," she said, once we were back outside. Could have? I didn't say anything else, and she didn't ask again. She'd stopped needing me to finish sentences a while back. We found the girl by accident, the way I found most of what mattered, walking somewhere else and choosing not to look away. The back market street ran behind the guild district, cheaper stalls, thinner law. A man in a merchant's coat too fine for the street he stood on had 6 people roped together at the wrist, and one of them, young, filthy, thin in a way that had nothing to do with fashion, had her teeth locked around the chain like she thought she could chew through iron with enough time. The merchant raised a hand to her. I stopped walking. The rope became a box before his hand finished its arc. One clean cut of nothing, and the chain simply wasn't there anymore, folded away into wherever I put things I didn't want to exist. The girl staggered, free, and looked at her own wrist like it had betrayed her by not hurting anymore. The merchant's strongbox went next, off the cart and into the same nowhere, ledgers and all. "You can't," he started. "I can," I said. I did. The transaction's canceled. He told me he'd call the guard. I told him to go ahead. They came faster than I expected, which told me something about how new this particular corruption still was. New enough that the guard captain hadn't yet learned to be slow about it. I opened the strongbox on the spot and handed over what was inside: 15 separate counts of unlicensed trafficking, dates, names, buyers, all of it written down by a man too greedy to burn his own paper trail. The guard read 4 lines and stopped asking me questions. He looked at me once more, decided I wasn't worth the paperwork of following up on either, and turned his attention to the others still roped together on the cart, cutting them loose with a knife instead of whatever I'd used. Some tools didn't need to be mysterious to work. They took the merchant. They left the girl with us because nobody else in the street was volunteering, and because Ellie had already crouched down to her level and started talking to her in the low, unhurried voice she used on things that were still deciding whether to trust her. Her name was Mia. She didn't say much else that first hour. By the second hour, she'd stopped flinching every time I moved, though she still watched my hands more than my face. A habit I recognized because I'd worn it myself once, in front of people who never gave me reason to drop it. I understood the feeling. I'd had a year to get used to what I could do, and some days it still didn't sit right. The commission board outside the guild hall was where the desperate news went to be public. 2 notices caught my eye the next morning. The first was fresh ink, still curling at the corners. The western corridor of the lower dungeon had destabilized overnight, collapsing entry routes and trapping 3 parties inside. 6 high-rank adventurers had already gone in and failed to clear it. The reward was generous in the way rewards get generous when nobody expects to have to pay it. I put my name down. Mine was the only one on the sheet. The clerk taking commissions looked at the card I handed over, then at me, then back at the card, in case rank F had changed meaning since she'd checked it that morning. "You're going in alone." She said it slowly, the way you'd explain to a child that the stove was hot. "No party, no listed weapon." "That's the plan," I said. She didn't argue further. She'd clearly decided I wasn't worth arguing with any longer. The second notice was smaller, older, tacked in a corner nobody had bothered to move. 16 rookie adventurers, missing. Last seen taking a commission near the Redstone mine. Posted by the adventurer who'd brought them the job in the first place, a woman named Reese. I'd seen this shape before in the Nether, more times than I like to count. A lure job that only ever moved one direction. I read the notice twice, filed the name away somewhere I wouldn't lose it, and didn't do anything else about it. Not yet. Some fires burn a while before you decide how to put them out. Redstone mine wasn't going anywhere. Neither was I. Not yet. The western corridor smelled like wet stone and old fear before I was even past the first bend. The smell of people who'd been trapped somewhere dark long enough to stop believing they'd leave it. I heard voices further in, muffled through collapsed rock, 3 different pitches of the same panic. The golem found me before I found it. Stone armored, the size of a guild hall turned sideways, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that had never once needed to hurry. It came at me mid-charge, one gray fist already swinging. I boxed it. One heartbeat, it was 30 tons of moving stone. The next, it was a cube small enough to fit in my palm. And the tunnel was very, very quiet. I put it in my inventory next to the merchant's strongbox and kept walking. The collapsed sections took longer, not because they were harder, only because there were more of them. 10 meters of rubble here, another 10 meters 20 paces further on, each one its own box, each one filed away until the corridor behind me looked like it had never fallen in at all. I restacked the last section into a clean wall at the dead end, just to see if I could, then walked back and undid it, because a wall with nowhere to go was just a different kind of trap. The 3 trapped parties came out blinking into torchlight that hadn't been there an hour before. 12 people, filthy, hollow-eyed, alive. They found a man in plain travel clothes standing in a corridor that had rearranged itself around him like furniture. No rope, no pickaxe, no visible reason any of it made sense. Nobody said anything useful. One of the high-rank adventurers, who'd failed to clear it that morning, opened his mouth twice and closed it both times without producing a word. A woman near the back started laughing, quietly. The specific laugh of someone whose brain had decided that was easier than screaming. Another of the freed adventurers, missing a boot, her ankle wrapped in someone else's shirt, asked me who I worked for. I told her nobody, picked up a fallen pack from where it had rolled against the wall, and set it back in her hands before she could ask a second question. I told them the way out was straight ahead now, said nothing about the golem in my pocket, and left before anyone recovered enough to follow. By the time I reached the surface, I could already hear the story starting behind me, growing a new detail with every retelling the way stories do when nobody involved understands what they actually saw. Word of a dungeon rearranging itself apparently traveled faster than I did. By the time Ellie and I reached our lodgings that evening, 6 men in city colors were waiting outside the door, and the one in front had the posture of a man who'd been told to bring someone back and intended to do it. He introduced himself as commander of Walright's elite guard and explained, with the patience of someone reciting something he'd said before, that abilities like mine belong to the state in times of need, and that I would be coming with him for evaluation and conscription. I told him I wouldn't. He explained it again, slower, as though the problem had been that I hadn't understood the first time. I told him again that I wouldn't, and this time I meant it the way a locked door means it. The 6 of them drew steel together, which was either bravery or a formality they'd all agreed to beforehand. I never found out which. It didn't matter. Their swords left their hands and stopped existing in the world for exactly as long as it took me to decide I'd made my point. 6 blades gone in the same breath, 6 soldiers left holding air and staring at their own empty fists, like the answer to a question they hadn't known to ask. I could have made the refusal costlier for them. I didn't see the use in it. 6 frightened men going home with a story about the stranger who handed back their own swords would do more for me in the long run than 6 broken wrists ever could. I gave the swords back one at a time, hilt first without a word, because taking a man's weapon to prove something and then keeping it besides was just theft with better manners. The youngest of the 6 sheathed his blade like it might still bite him on the way in. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I take commissions, I told the commander, once he had his own sword back in hand and hadn't found a use for it. Posted ones, paid ones. I'm not a conscript, and I'm not going to be one tonight or any other night. If your city needs the kind of help I give, it knows where the board is. He didn't try again. I didn't wait to see whether that was wisdom or just the shock still working its way through him. Ellie fell into step beside me as we walked away, quiet in the way that meant she was pleased, and didn't feel any need to say so. By the time we were ready to leave Walright, the city had already decided what to call me. Reincarnation. Devil, the story went. A man who walked into a dungeon dead men couldn't clear and stacked it into shape like a child's toy. The golem story grew a second head and a burning sword by the 3rd retelling, and I stopped bothering to correct any of it after the first day. 3 guilds sent runners with recruitment offers before the week was out. One offered a standing contract and a share of future spoils. Another offered coin outright, more than I'd seen change hands in Port Belgas in a year. The 3rd didn't bother making an offer at all, just asked what I wanted, which was, in its own way, the most honest approach of the 3, and still not enough. I declined all 3 the same way I declined the commander, politely, once, and without room for a second conversation. Mia stayed behind in a shelter the guild arranged, the kind of arrangement that existed for people the streets had used up and nobody else had claimed. I didn't see her again before we left. What I heard, later, secondhand, from someone who'd been in the room when the aid worker recorded her account of that night was one line she gave without being asked to elaborate. He didn't look like a hero. He just fixed it and left. That was the most accurate description of me I ever heard from someone who wasn't Ellie. We left before the guild runners could find our lodgings a second time, on a road that pointed toward a bigger town called Chaldea, where Ellie said the kind of paper that made a person legally real could be bought without a church's prices attached. I still didn't have an identity crest, still didn't have a name anyone with real power would recognize, and still had a strongbox, and a golem, and a great deal of other people's coin sitting in a space that didn't officially exist. All of that needed a legal reason to exist eventually. Chaldea, apparently, was where reasons like that got manufactured. Ellie walked half a step behind me, the way she did when she was thinking about something she hadn't decided to say yet. She'd been doing more of that lately. The private thinking, the borrowed spellbook she thought I hadn't noticed, the hour she disappeared into most evenings and came back from smelling faintly of ozone. I let her have it. Whatever she was building in that hour was hers to finish in her own time. The walls of Walright shrank behind us, the same way Port Belgas's harbor had, a few weeks before, smaller, then gone, then just another place I used to be. I didn't look back at either one. Looking back had never once told me anything I didn't already know. Chaldea took 4 more days on the road, and none of those days were worth remembering. What was worth remembering waited for us at the end of it. A frontier town built loud and fast around its monster-infested hills, taverns, and forges, standing shoulder to shoulder with weapon shops that never seemed to close. At the center of all of it stood 5 stories of gray stone, a sunburst crest bolted above brass doors, and a line of adventurers and merchants stretching past the fountain in the square outside. I didn't join it. Instead, I found a clerk working a side counter, set a single relic down in front of him, and told him there were several thousand more where it came from. His hand shook before he'd even finished picking it up. It was a fire-striking stone, one of the smaller pieces I'd carried out of the deepest vault in the Nether, worth more on its own than most of what passed through that hall in a week. He excused himself and came back with a man twice his age, the branch's chief appraiser, and the appraiser did not shake at all. He went still instead, the particular stillness of a careful man standing next to something expensive. We settled into the back room. Ellie took the corner chair, quiet, and watched the numbers change on the appraiser's slate faster than he could write them down. I emptied enough of the inventory onto the table to make his hands slow further. Obsidian shards, hitting metal ingots, things that hadn't existed on any surface market since the day the Nether sealed itself off from the world above. I named a figure I already knew was low. He countered with one that told me he knew it too. We met somewhere in the middle, the way two people do when neither of them wants to be the one who blinks first. By the time we left that room, the largest single transaction in the branch's recorded history had my name on the receipt. 10 billion coins, sitting in an account under a name the kingdom didn't officially recognize yet. A problem for tomorrow, not tonight. Enough, either way, to buy every upgrade Hakanawa had ever dangled in front of me and still have most of it left over. I folded the transfer chit twice, tucked it inside my coat, and walked back out past the line I hadn't waited in. Ellie didn't say anything until we were nearly to the doors. Then she asked quietly what I was going to spend it on first. Haven't decided. I turned the transfer chit over once in my fingers before I put it away for good. There's a lot of it, and I intend to spend all of it in the right order. She said that sounded like me. I took it as a compliment, because it was one. The reception hall was louder leaving than it had been coming in. Word travels fast in a room built for money. Two adventurers near the doors decided Ellie was worth commenting on. Her plain traveling dress, the scar peeking above her collar, the fact that a girl her age was walking beside a man who'd just made guild history without raising his voice once. They said it loud enough to be heard, the way men talk when they want an audience more than an answer. I started toward them. I didn't get there. Ellie turned first. She met both of their eyes, didn't raise her voice, and said exactly one sentence. I was too far away to hear it. Whatever it was, it worked better than anything I would have done. Both men went the color of old paper and left through a side door without looking back at either of us. What did you tell them? I asked once we were back outside, the fountain throwing light across the square. I explained the math of the situation. She smoothed her sleeve and didn't elaborate, and her face didn't invite me to ask again. I decided I didn't need to understand it to appreciate it. It had been a long time since something that simple had pleased me this much, and I let myself have it without saying so out loud. It occurred to me, walking away from that hall, that a year ago she would have gone pale and small in a moment like that. She hadn't gone small in a long time. I noticed these things more than I let on. I was starting to suspect she knew that. We picked the Mage Guild over the Adventurers Hall for one reason. Ellie's training needed a home, and I had none of my own worth offering her, so I went looking for one instead. Electro Brave turned out to be the smallest building in the entire guild district. One room, one desk, a sign out front so weathered the paint had given up on most of its letters. I'd expected quiet. Frontier Mage Guilds usually ran quiet. This one was quieter than that, in the specific way an empty room is quiet. The woman behind the desk had her boots up on it and a book open in her lap. She looked maybe 25. She looked at us like she'd been expecting us longer than we'd actually been standing there. You have more anger in you than any human I've met in 70 years. She closed the book without marking her page. I've decided to find out what you do with it. I asked how old that made her, exactly. She said she was an elf, which she seemed to consider a complete answer on its own, and that the wind told her things about people the same way weather tells a farmer things about the season. She'd simply gotten better at reading it than most farmers. Over the centuries, she'd had to practice. I filed that under things I would need to think about later, and didn't argue with any of it. There wasn't much point arguing with someone who'd already decided what she found interesting. The receptionist came out from the back room at the sound of new voices. Younger than Elena, red hair, a white shirt, and black vest pressed too neatly for a guild that clearly didn't get much foot traffic. She introduced herself as Rory, guild receptionist, and everything else that needed doing, and had 2 registration forms in our hands before either of us had said we wanted to register. I gave my name the way I'd been giving it since Wallwright. No alias. No complications. Electro Brave would do, I told her. Smallest guild in the district, which meant the least attention, and attention was the only thing I was still trying to avoid. Rory read down the assets line on my form and stopped breathing for a second. She looked up at Elena. "Is this a joke?" she said. "Or should I be getting the mayor?" "Neither." I nudged the form an inch closer to her side of the desk. "Just file it." Elena didn't look up from her book. Under rank, I wrote the truth. F. Nobody at that desk corrected it, and I didn't offer to explain it. Somewhere in that silence was the entire joke of my life since the abyss, and I was the only one in the room who could hear it. Ellie signed her own line beneath mine and listed her craft as apprentice mage, out loud in front of witnesses, for the first time since I'd noticed her studying alone most evenings and said nothing about it. Elena glanced up at that. Something sharper than curiosity crossed her face before it settled again into the same unbothered calm. I didn't say anything either. There would be time for that conversation. This wasn't it. Rory stamped both forms and slid 2 plain bronze discs across the desk, no bigger than coins, each stamped with Electro Brave's mark. Mine came with a rank letter I could finally use to spend money instead of just carry it in an account ledger. By the time she finished, I had become, on paper, the least significant member of the smallest guild in Chaldea, sitting on more coin than that guild had likely seen in the last decade combined. Nobody in the room but me seemed to find that funny. Elena, watching me over the top of her book, looked like she might be starting to. Elena walked us 3 streets over on her own initiative and said only that the man behind the next door was worth knowing. His name was Ren, and his office belonged to the SSS Merchant Alliance. Narrow, orderly, nothing on any shelf out of line. He asked 3 questions before he'd finished shaking my hand. What did I need done? How quickly? How much of it needed to stay quiet? I answered all 3 honestly. It seemed to be the correct approach, because he had 2 offers on the table before I'd finished giving the 3rd answer: land wherever I wanted it, and passage through whatever logistics the road to the tower would eventually require. I took both. Elena, leaning in the doorway through most of this, said it was the fastest she'd seen Ren commit to anything since she'd known him. Ren didn't dispute it. He didn't look up from the paperwork he was already drawing up either. He leaned back in his chair once the ink was down. "What are you building toward?" "Several things," I said, in the right order. "That's sufficient." That was the entire negotiation. No argument about price, no request for collateral, no questions about how a man registered at rank F had come by land money and a private fortune in the same afternoon. I left his office with a logistics director, a land broker, and the growing private sense that Chaldea was assembling itself around me faster than I'd planned for when I walked into it that morning. A year ago, I'd have distrusted anything moving that fast in my direction. Walking back out into the afternoon light, I decided not to argue with it this time. Elena found us there again before we'd left for the night, a folded page in her hand and no ceremony about handing it over. Her network had handed her something, unprompted. A report on a guild called Silver Feather, X rank a little over a year ago, B rank now. She set the page on the desk between us. 14 months, and nobody's saying why. I read it twice. My face didn't move. Ellie's eyes moved instead, to my hands, which had gone very still on the page in a way they hadn't been a moment before. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. You knew already. It wasn't a question, and Elena didn't wait for one. I knew something like it was coming, I said. I didn't need a report to tell me what happens to a guild that runs on people it never valued. She studied me for a moment, the way she'd studied me from behind her desk that first afternoon, like she was reading weather instead of a face, and didn't push any further. I folded the report the same way I'd folded the transfer chit that morning, and put it away in the same pocket. There was still a notice from Wallwright in that coat too. 16 missing adventurers, and a name that meant nothing to me yet. I hadn't touched it. I wasn't ready to, not with a guild, a logistics director, and an afternoon's worth of decisions still settling into place around me. 10 billion coins had bought me all of that in a single day. It hadn't bought me patience, and I was beginning to think I'd need more of that than money before this was finished. Silver Feather could wait a little longer to learn what it had thrown away. I already knew what it had lost the day they threw me into that abyss. Elena's network had simply caught up to the math. Outside, Chaldea was settling into its evening noise, forges banking their fires, taverns filling up loud enough to hear through the cracked window. Ellie gathered her things and asked if we were staying in town that night. I told her yes. Tomorrow, there would be a Heikanua tree to spend a fortune on, and a mine notice from another city that wasn't going to stay quiet in my coat pocket forever. Morning came. I had 2 problems left over from the night before, and I decided to solve them in the same trip. The Hakaniwa tree still had a branch I hadn't touched. The redstone mine notice was still folded in my coat pocket, where it had been sitting since a city I hadn't visited in weeks. Ellie didn't ask why I wanted to test new numbers over old stone instead of somewhere softer. She just laced her boots and came. The mine had been picked clean of the ore that gave it its name a generation back. What was left was low-rank vermin, a scatter of minecarts nobody had bothered to haul out, and enough leftover glow in the walls to see by without a torch. Good enough for what I wanted, which was privacy and low stakes. I opened the ledger only I could see and started spending. 50 million coins went into the box that had been sitting closed since the day I registered at Electro Brave, Manacraft. The ability to take a working of mana, mine or someone else's, and fold it down into something I could hold, throw, or crush. Not a shield anymore, a weapon. What was left of the fortune went into 2 smaller boxes beside it. Artifact creation, which the interface described as turning raw materials into objects with their own standing effects. No synthesis required. And a box marked for volatile compounds, mana-reactive, unstable when boxed and released on purpose. The interface didn't call it a bomb. It didn't need to. I didn't know yet what I'd build with either one. I filed both away the way I filed everything else, for later when later arrived. I tested artifact creation once, on a fist-sized chunk of the mine's own rubble, and watched it come out the other side as a plain iron lamp that lit itself without oil and didn't need a match. Small, useless for a fight. Proof the box worked exactly the way the interface claimed. I put the lamp in the inventory next to the coins I hadn't spent yet, and thought about what the same process would do to something built on purpose instead of scrap. One branch past that, the tree narrowed to a single locked box, with a price on it I didn't have. 1 billion coins, and a note underneath in small script, requires prior tier. I looked at it the way I'd look at a door I intended to open eventually, closed it, and moved on. There was no use standing in front of a wall I couldn't pay down yet. That's it? Ellie tilted her head at me. You spent a house on that face? I don't have a house yet. I closed the ledger. Throw something at me. Anything with a temperature. She hesitated, then lifted a hand and sent a bolt of ice at my chest, more out of trust than aggression. I caught the spell mid-flight, folded it into a fist-sized block of packed frost, and closed my hand around it until it cracked apart into slush running down my glove. Ellie stared at the water dripping off my knuckles. That's not fair to anyone who ever fights you. No, I shook the last of it loose. It isn't. She laughed, short and surprised at herself for doing it, then caught the sound and folded it back down. Like laughing too easily in front of me was a thing she still hadn't given herself permission for. I noticed. I filed that away too. We went deeper because the notice in my pocket said someone still thought this mine was worth checking, and because half-tested power works better on something that's actually trying to kill you. The tunnels narrowed. The glow in the walls thinned to almost nothing, and the first sound that reached us wasn't vermin. It was too many footsteps for a mine this picked over. Bone-white shapes filed out of side tunnels that weren't supposed to have anything left in them. Archers at the back, blades up front, and a knot of them in rotted robes carrying enchanted weapons. The only reason something without a mind could work a spell at all. I counted somewhere past 60 before I stopped counting and moved. I threw 2 boxes I'd built on the walk down, one packed red, one packed a bitter cold blue, and let them land in the middle of the formation. The red one caught a blade and went up the second steel opened it, taking the swordsman with it. The purple one froze a line of archers to the ankle before the ice climbed higher than bone was built to hold, and took the legs out from under them. One arrow got past the ice and skimmed close enough to Ellie's shoulder that she flinched. I put myself between her and the next volley without thinking about it. The robed ones raised their weapons together, and the ground in front of me buckled with the beginning of an earth spell, aimed wide enough to catch us both. I folded it mid-cast into a block of gray stone before it ever broke the surface, then closed the last of the distance in one stroke, obsidian edge and Manacraft together. The tunnel was quiet again before Ellie had finished raising her hands to help. Small green lights drifted up from where the bones had fallen, one for each kill, and I understood without being told to reach for them. They came into my hand like warmth going somewhere it was needed, and a line of text I hadn't seen before settled into the corner of my vision. Experience gained. Ellie was looking at the same empty air and seeing nothing. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "Nothing you can see yet." I didn't explain further because I didn't fully understand it myself, only that it fed the same tree the coins did, and that was worth knowing quietly for now. She lowered her hands slowly. "That's supposed to be a beginner ground." It was. I looked at the empty stretch where 60 of those things weren't supposed to have been standing an hour ago. Somebody's feeding this pit more than it should have left to feed. We found the body a while later, past the second cart rail, in a side tunnel nobody mining anything would have bothered walking into. Ellie saw it before I could put myself between her and it. She didn't scream. She just went still in the particular way of someone who taught herself a long time ago not to. He hadn't died down here of hunger, and he hadn't died to anything with bones. I didn't need a healer's eye for that. I put my coat over what needed covering and made a note that had nothing to do with monsters. A hunting ground doesn't refill itself with 60 extra bodies on its own. Somewhere under this mine, there was a spawner, one of the invisible tiers the guilds called Hell's Invoice, and something was using it on purpose. On the walk back out, I stripped a vein of redstone from the wall anyway, out of habit more than need, and boxed it into inventory. Ore that carried its own charge of lightning wasn't a thing worth leaving behind just because the day had turned into something worse than a training run. "We should tell Elena," Ellie said quietly. "We will." I stood. All of it. Elena was waiting when we got back, which meant she'd known we were going before we left. A folder sat on her desk that hadn't been there that morning. "You look like you found something you didn't like," she said, reading the air around me the way she always did. "Let's start with what you found first." She slid the folder across. It was thicker than the one she'd shown me weeks ago, and this one had a name at the top I recognized. Silver Feather. I read it once through myself, then read the parts that mattered out loud, because Ellie deserved to hear it in the order it happened, rather than the order it had been filed. Within 2 weeks of my death, the excess gear the guild had always handed me to carry started going missing from storage, because nobody left behind bothered tracking what nobody carried. Victor ordered the boy who replaced me to haul his personal luggage on missions. The boy quit inside a month. On the national contract that followed, the party never reached the dungeon at all. They ran out of carrying capacity half a day out and turned back. The first failed national mission in the guild's history. Nathan stopped scouting entirely, on the grounds that scouting had never been his job to begin with. And when a scout still willing to do the work pointed out that Victor had misread the route, Victor hit him. The scout didn't get back up. The national authority stripped Silver Feather of its X rank not long after. Current standing, B-. Serena hadn't said one public word about any of it, in any hall, to any reporter, in 14 months. That silence was its own kind of answer. She could smile at a man while she let go of his hand over an abyss. She apparently couldn't smile through this. I set the folder down. Elena had told me the shape of this once already, in passing, over a report that only had a rank and a number of months in it. This one had names. I thought about the weight of the bags I used to carry without complaint, and the soup I used to eat because it was the only food anyone offered a stone rank porter, and I found I couldn't manage even a flicker of satisfaction. Just the flat certainty of a man reading a weather report about a storm he'd already lived through. Ellie listened without a word the whole way through. When I finished, she asked only one thing. "They argued about the luggage?" "Yes." Her jaw tightened. "While people were waiting?" "Yes." There wasn't anything truer to say twice. That was one of the things I was going to carry for a long time too. Not the falling, the luggage. Ellie had been sold once for less thought than Victor gave a bag of luggage. She didn't say that. She didn't have to. I'd known it since the night I pulled her out of a burning port town, and I understood, watching her face right then, that she'd heard every word of that report as a mirror instead of a story about somebody else. Elena watched the two of us for a moment, head tilted the way it went when she was reading more than either of us had said out loud. "Your hands went still again," she told me. "Same as the first time I mentioned them. They do that." I didn't offer anything past it. She let the silence sit before she slid a second folder across, thinner, newer. "There's more, and it isn't about them." She tapped a line near the top. 8 more names went up on the board this week. Low rank, everyone, all posted to the same commission, all through the same handler. She turned the page toward me. Rise, the same name already sitting in your coat pocket. That puts the count at roughly 24 missing, as far as anyone's managed to count. Rory had flagged the first of the new postings for her 2 days ago, she said, back when it was only 3 names, and easy to write off as chance. Elena had kept pulling the thread herself once it stopped looking like chance. 24 people don't disappear on the same posting by accident. No, she agreed, they don't. I pulled every board notice from 3 towns to be sure it was one handler, and not a coincidence of bad luck. It isn't a coincidence. The mine, I said. The mine. She watched me the way she watched weather coming in. You found something down there today. A body, older than the notice should explain. I didn't tell her the rest, that whoever was running that pit reminded me, in the coldest way, of an organization that used to hand its weakest member every job nobody else wanted and call it fair. I wasn't ready to hand her that thought yet, not even her. I'm taking the commission, I said instead. Company? No. You could use it. I'm not as useless as I look behind a desk. I don't doubt that. I closed the second folder. I want to know what's happening down there before I decide how many people should know about it. I stood. Ellie didn't argue, which meant she'd already decided this one was mine to walk into alone. She only reached over and squeezed my sleeve once, briefly, the closest thing she had to asking me to come back the same shape I left in. Elena studied me a moment longer, head tilted like she was reading something written in the air over my shoulder. The thing you're not telling me, she said, is the most interesting part. I didn't answer that. Answering would have meant admitting she was right, and I wasn't ready to hand her that either. Ellie went ahead to the room. I stood outside a moment longer with the second folder still in my hand. 24 names I hadn't read yet. I spent what was left of the evening packing for 1 instead of 2. Rope, dried rations, and the little iron lamp I'd made out of mine rubble that morning. The kind that lit itself without oil or a match. I packed it anyway. Silver Feather could keep falling without me watching. It had managed that fine on its own for over a year, and it would keep managing without any help from me for a while longer. The mine was a nearer problem and a quieter one, and for once, I intended to walk into something without Ellie beside me to keep me from doing anything reckless. That didn't worry me the way it should have. I had died enough times already that the idea of dying once more, alone, in the dark, under a mine that was feeding itself 60 extra corpses a week, had stopped registering as a threat and started registering as an inconvenience. Hector had given me that much, whether he meant to or not. Somewhere behind me, past a dungeon and an abyss I still hadn't forgotten the taste of, was an inscription that had promised a garden to the burden and hell to the bastard. I'd spent a year building toward the first half of that. The mine, the notice, and whoever was feeding a hunting ground 60 bodies a week felt like the second half starting to introduce itself. Tomorrow, I was going back down alone. Ellie hadn't argued when I told her this one was mine alone. She'd just squeezed my sleeve once at the door, which from her was the loudest kind of worry, and let me go. Elena had offered a partner too. I'd turned both of them down, because whatever had been feeding 60 skeletons, a steady diet of dead rookies, wasn't something I wanted to introduce to anyone I cared about before I understood what it was. The commission notice waiting at the entrance called the 7th Site's access shaft unstable, dangerous enough to justify hazard pay. That was the first lie. I ran a hand along the tunnel wall and found a cut too clean for a collapse. Straight edges, even depth, the kind of mark a pick makes when someone wants a passage to look abandoned instead of used. I boxed a chunk of it into my inventory to study later and kept walking. The deeper I went, the more the upkeep gave itself away. Support beams that should have rotted through stood freshly braced. A side passage that should have been rubble had been swept clear enough to walk without stooping. Somewhere below me, a redstone-powered minecart clicked along its rails on a schedule no abandoned mine needed to keep. Someone had been maintaining this place as a hunting ground long after it stopped being anything else, and they'd been careless enough, or arrogant enough, to leave the seams showing. I passed the chamber where I'd buried a nameless corpse the week before and didn't stop. Whoever was running this had already told me everything I needed to know without saying a word. Elena's count had put the missing near this mine at roughly 24, all of them stone rank, all of them the kind of adventurer nobody important would go looking for. A mine that ate rookies and dressed its own maintenance up as decay wasn't a monster problem. It was a business, and businesses had someone running them. 2 more tunnels branched off before the passage narrowed toward a junction ahead, both of them showing the same 2 clean cuts as the entrance. I ignored both and kept to the main shaft, because whoever had built this wanted traffic funneled one direction, and I wanted to see what they were funneling it toward. She came around the corner already crying, robe torn at one shoulder, hair full of rock dust, both hands out like she meant to fall into me. Please, help me, they're still back there. I caught her wrists before she could close the distance and looked her over instead of comforting her. The robe was torn in 3 places and dust stained everywhere else, but the skin underneath the tears was clean. No scrapes, no bruising, nothing that matched a woman who'd supposedly spent days running through a collapsing mine. Her nails were clean too, and her hair had been mussed by hand rather than by falling debris. the strands pulled loose in a pattern too even to be an accident. She'd built the whole picture carefully. She just hadn't accounted for someone actually checking it. Which party were you with? She gave me 3 names, fast and smooth. The kind of answer that comes preloaded rather than remembered under panic. That party posted a completion report 3 days ago, I told her, watching her face instead of her wounds. They're alive. They're topside. They've already spent the pay. So who are you? She stopped crying, not slowly, all at once, the way a wire goes slack when you cut it. The woman who'd been begging a stranger for help a heartbeat earlier straightened her spine, wiped her face dry with the flat of her hand, and looked at me the way you look at a problem instead of a person. She told me her name was Rise, admitted the name was a costume, and said I'd ruined a performance she was proud of. The first mark in months who hadn't cried the whole way in. Most of them, she said, believed her before she'd even finished the first sentence. I told her I didn't care whose performance it was, or how many times it had worked before tonight. I asked what was waiting back there that she'd wanted me walking toward. She smiled instead of answering, looked me over the way you'd size up a purchase, and told me to see for myself. I'd earned it, she said, for being interesting. The first mark in months worth showing the whole operation to, instead of just feeding to it. She led me through a door built into the rock, and the tunnel opened into a chamber that had never been a mining site. Old miners' cells lined both walls, pickaxes long gone. The doors fitted instead with new iron bars. Behind them were people, or what was left of people partway through becoming something else. None of them could speak anymore. I looked long enough to confirm that, and no longer. Crates of supplies sat stacked against the far wall. Bandages, restraints, sedatives in labeled glass. All of it ordered and paid for by someone who expected a steady stream of subjects rather than 1 or 2. This wasn't an experiment being run in secret on a shoestring. It was a facility with a supply chain. A ledger sat open on a stone table, and I read it while Reese watched, entertained by my interest rather than alarmed by it. 37 names, 37 attempts at whatever process this was. 24 had survived it well enough to be moved to a second location. The other 13 were the reason the cells still had bodies in them. One entry near the bottom belonged to a boy named Ashley, recruited off a message board in the capital with a promise of an easy dungeon to level in. Walked down here by a fake gold rank party, paid to smile at him the whole way. He'd come from a border village, the kind of place that measured a son's worth by whether he stayed to farm or left to matter, and by every account he'd left convinced he was going to make his parents proud instead of making them bury an empty grave. The margin note called his death a failure of method, nothing more. It didn't record what he'd been thinking about at the end. I already knew, without needing it written down, that it would have been them. I'd felt this exact shape of thing before, not the laboratory, the feeling underneath it. Years ago, a woman had taken me into a mountain forest on the pretense of a herb gathering quest, handed me a staff she called too filthy for her own hands to touch, and spent months testing a spell meant to make people obey without letting them scream about it. I lived on bad soup and worse bread through all of it, and told myself the anger was the only thing keeping me upright. I recognized the feeling of being somebody's resource. I'd had a long time to memorize it, and it had stopped being able to reach me the way it used to. I looked up from the ledger. You work for someone, not a question. She lit up at that, proud instead of cautious, and told me, in more words than the sentence needed, that all of this served her beloved sister, an executive of the Silver Feather Guild named Helena, and that once Helena's work was finished, the world would have nothing left in it but beautiful things. I didn't tell her Helena and I were already acquainted. I filed the name away with everything else Silver Feather had cost me and asked myself quietly whether Serena knew what her own executive was funding with the guild's coin. I decided it didn't matter yet. It would matter later. She walked me deeper, past the cells, into a chamber where the rock itself ran warm and the walls threw off a low orange light that had nothing to do with the witch lamps. She'd heard the name Reincarnation Devil somewhere in her research and told me, almost disappointed, that she'd expected someone more impressive in person. Then she pressed her palm flat against a rune carved into the far wall. The wall answered by opening into a wider cavern I hadn't seen behind it. What stood up out of the heat was built like a person the way a fist is built like a hand. Same idea. None of the gentleness. 20 feet of enchanted iron and packed stone unfolded itself joint by joint until its head nearly brushed the ceiling, molten seams running along its joints where the magma vein fed it directly. I'd died to constructs built along similar lines more times than I could count, in a fortress that doesn't exist anymore. 1,000 deaths teach a body which threats are worth being afraid of. This one didn't clear the bar. It was well made. It was also the first thing all night that had been built to hurt people, rather than just deceive them, and there was something almost restful in that honesty. Rise gave the order. Elise, I made myself think, since the act was over, and the golem obliged by coming straight across the chamber floor at me. It didn't run so much as arrive, each footfall cracking rock underneath it, one massive fist already swinging before it had fully closed the distance. Heat rolled off it in a wave that reached me before the fist did, and somewhere behind it, Elise was laughing, already certain how this ended. I let it get close before I boxed the swinging arm off at the shoulder. The whole limb went into my inventory mid-strike, and the golem's momentum carried it 2 more steps on the strength of a punch that no longer existed. Rubble sprayed where the fist should have landed, and the sound it made hitting empty air instead of me was almost comical. It stopped, iron head tilting like it was trying to work out where the rest of itself had gone. The enchantment reads damage, not humiliation, and this was the first damage it had ever taken. Elise's mouth was open. I didn't waste the opening explaining myself. I used the gap where the arm had been to box a compound I'd synthesized on the walk down, volatile, unstable, built for exactly one purpose, straight into the golem's chest cavity, then boxed the severed arm back into place behind it to seal the gap shut. The whole exchange took less time than it takes to describe it. I met her eyes across the chamber. I put something inside it. You have about 5 seconds to tell it to stand still. Whatever awareness the enchantment carried registered the threat sitting in its own chest, because the golem obeyed her before she'd finished shouting the order. It went rigid mid-stride and stayed that way, arms half raised, a weapon that had forgotten how to move. I crossed the space between us while she was still staring at her own golem and boxed her wrists together behind her back. Restraints assembled on the spot from scrap iron in my inventory, cinched shut before she'd finished registering that I'd moved. She thrashed once, felt how little that accomplished, and stopped. Her free hand had still been twitching toward her belt, and I caught the motion for what it was half a second before she committed to it. A second device, meant to bring this chamber down the way its twin back at the entrance was probably meant to bring down the tunnels behind us. I boxed it out of her hand mid-activation. It went dark and inert in my inventory. Whatever it had been built to finish left unfinished. Killing her would have been faster. It would not have been useful. Dead women don't answer questions, and I had too many left. Who gave her the orders? Where the 24 went? How far up the silver feather name actually reached? Whether the person funding the crates of restraints and sedatives had a name I'd recognize. I needed her breathing more than I needed her gone. That was the first time she looked at me like I was a threat instead of an obstacle. Everything up to that point, the crying act, the reveal, even the golem, she'd treated like a game she still expected to win. The dead device in my inventory was the moment the game stopped. Her shoulders dropped. You should have just killed me. It wasn't defiance. It was the closest thing to fear I'd heard out of her all night, and it told me more than the ledger had. Whatever Helena did to the people who failed her, Elise was more afraid of it than she was of me. I'll know, I said, once the questions are answered. I spent the walk back boxing everything the laboratory had been built from. The ledger, the cell doors, the specimens who couldn't be helped anymore, every jar and residue sample on the shelves, the supply crates against the far wall, until the chamber behind us was bare rock again. Evidence didn't do anyone any good rotting in a mine waiting for the next person to stumble onto it, and I wasn't leaving anything down here for a second operator to pick back up once word got out that the first one was gone. The golem I left standing exactly where it had frozen, arms half raised, 5 seconds of patience away from becoming a very large problem for whoever came looking for it next. I didn't disarm it. Something that size tends to discourage casual visitors, and I liked the idea of Helena's people finding a locked door with teeth. Elise walked in front of me the whole way out, wrists boxed, saying nothing else. Whatever bravado she'd carried into that chamber, she'd spent the last of it on one sentence. I had a laboratory's worth of paperwork in my inventory, and a captured lieutenant who called an executive of the guild that once discarded me, her beloved sister. None of the ledger's entries said where the second site was, only that one existed, which meant the questions ahead of me were bigger than the mine I was walking out of. Gray light was already coming down the entrance shaft by the time we reached it, thin and colorless. The kind that shows up before the sun does. Whatever Silver Feather's collapse looked like from the inside, it had just lost a working lieutenant and an active laboratory in the same night, and not one of them would know it happened until I decided they should. The mine had turned into a longer list of questions than the one I'd walked in with. That was fine. I'd learned a long time ago that the questions were usually where the real work started. I put the ledger on the table between us before I said a word. Getting it there had taken most of the morning. Elena had cleared out a back storeroom of the guild hall overnight and painted 4 warding circles into the floorboards herself, 1 for containment, 3 because she didn't trust the first one alone with something Helena had trained. By the time the paint had dried and I'd walked at least the last stretch from the mine, midday light was coming thin and gray through the one high slit window, and she still smelled faintly of scorched cloth from the golem she'd lost. She sat across from me in the only chair in the room, wrists bound in front of her, watching the ledger the way a person watches someone else count out exactly how much they owe. Elena's healers had already dealt with the worst of what the golem's explosion had left on her. Burns closed. Most of the pain scrubbed out with magic I didn't ask about. That was deliberate on my part. I wanted her talking because talking was in her own interest, not because pain was running out on a clock somewhere. Pain gets you noise. It doesn't get you names. 14 hours of documentation, I said. 37 names in it, and I already know what happened to most of them. Every page came out of your own laboratory. I'm going to ask who paid for it and who built it with you. You're going to answer, because the alternative is I hand all of this to the national authority, and you spend what's left of your life as the only surviving witness to a crime the government would rather bury than admit exists. She didn't answer right away. I let her look at the ledger a while longer instead of filling the silence for her. That was the whole method. I wasn't going to hurt her for information. I didn't need to. I only needed her to run the numbers herself and arrive somewhere useful. I'd learned the shape of this kind of person in Chaldea, and before that in a mine full of golems, convinced of her own reasoning right up until reality stopped agreeing with it. Once it did, people like that didn't dig in. They recalculated. All I had to do was wait for the recalculation to finish. When she finally spoke, it wasn't defiance, it was arithmetic. I watched her weigh it. Prison and exposure against cooperation, and whatever came after, and land, predictably, on the version of herself that survived. She started talking about Helena. She didn't say the name like it cost her anything. If anything, her voice softened, describing the work, the way people talk about something they were proud to have been part of. The hybrid project wasn't cruelty dressed up as research, she told me. It was commissioned. Someone with money and reach had asked Helena for a specific kind of weapon, creatures built to shrug off the wardlocks guarding the black obsidian spire, built to absorb the kind of elemental strikes that dropped ordinary monsters where they stood. Beauty, to Helena, apparently included function. She wasn't making monsters. She was building keys. One prototype, Elise said, could walk straight through a containment ward without ever triggering it. Not break it, just fail to register against it. The way a proper key doesn't force a lock so much as agree with it. I already knew Helena's name. I'd learned it in the mine from this same woman, and I'd been carrying it since. What I hadn't had was a reason, a shape to the operation bigger than one lieutenant and one lab. Now I did. A government contract needing a very specific lock picked, and a spire I already had my own reasons to walk into eventually. I tapped the ledger once. Who's paying for the key? She called him by an alias, not a name. She didn't know his real one, and I believed her. The way she said it read like someone repeating a password she'd been handed, not something she understood. Ministerial tier, she said. Access to funds most administrators never touched in their whole careers. He'd been routing them through dummy commissions filed with the Adventurers Authority, a road survey here, a bridge inspection there, paperwork thick enough that nobody below a certain rank ever looked twice, dressing embezzlement up as procurement. The hybrid project was only one of 4 operations he had running at once, all pointed at the same target. Make himself the man actually holding the kingdom together by the time the Black Obsidian Spire opened its doors again. One of the other 3, she said, was buying up grain contracts across the eastern provinces, months ahead of this year's harvest. Another was quietly bankrolling a mercenary company that officially didn't exist. She didn't know what the 4th one was for, only that it existed, and that it worried her more than the other 3 combined, because nobody had ever bothered explaining it to her. What's the alias? She told me. 2 words, official sounding. The kind of thing stamped on a requisition form nobody was supposed to read twice. Elena's voice came through the door before I'd finished repeating it back. I know that seal. There's exactly one man in the capital who signs with it. His name is Silas. Silas. I turned the name over once and set it down next to Helena's. 2 names now, out of 2 different ledgers, and the private list of things I meant to finish had just doubled in size without becoming any less certain. The recalibration took less time than I expected. It just meant more work, arranged in a different order. There was a piece of this that didn't sit flat, and I said so out loud. mostly to hear whether Elise had an answer for it. Silver Feather held its charter through the Zestia Empire. Whoever signed with that seal answered to Batland's ministry instead. Those two crowns hadn't agreed on anything in a decade, not even where their own shared border actually sat. And a Batland official quietly funding a project that served a Zestia chartered guild wasn't the kind of detail that resolved itself into something neat. Elise didn't have an answer. She looked as thrown by it as I felt, which told me something on its own. She hadn't been curious enough to ask the question herself. She'd taken the money and the orders and never once wondered why they came from two directions that were supposed to hate each other. Elena added one more thing before she went quiet again on the other side of the door. Silas had sat on the same ministerial council for longer than she'd been alive. In elf years, publicly unremarkable. The kind of official whose name showed up on approvals and nowhere else. Nobody outside that council chamber would have looked at him twice. That told me more about how long this had been running than anything Elise had said so far. I filed the question next to the others. I didn't have answers for yet and let it sit there. 4 operations, 1 alias, a tower with a closing date on it. Whatever Silas actually wanted, he wasn't building it quietly enough to stay hidden much longer. Not now that I had a name for him. I asked one more question before I let her rest her voice. How was Helena funded before Silas ever entered the picture? Before the ministry? Before the alias? Before any of this had a government's money behind it? Elise paused for the first time all day, not calculating this time, just remembering. Private commissions, she said. A guild, back before any of this scaled up, had paid for experimental subjects the same way you'd pay for livestock, by the head, no questions asked about where they came from or what happened to them afterward. She didn't know the guild's name. She'd been brought in after the operation was already running, handed procedure instead of contracts, told which subjects to log and which ones not to bother logging at all. I knew the guild's name. I'd been one of the subjects, long before there was a ledger or a lab or a mine to hide it in. I'd spent weeks in a mountain forest eating soup with no taste in it, while Helena tested how far a mind could be pushed before it stopped being a mind, and I'd survived it. And Serena was the one who'd handed me to her, quietly, without a second thought, the way you hand over a tool you've stopped needing. The memory didn't come back to me as pictures. It came back as the taste of that soup, which was still nothing, all these years later, whenever I let myself sit with it too long. Helena hadn't built her technique on strangers first. She'd built it on me, refined it on the people in that ledger, and gotten good enough at it that a government minister was now paying to have it turned into a weapon. I didn't say any of that out loud. Elise didn't need to know it, and saying it wouldn't have changed anything sitting in that room. I filed it where I filed everything else that mattered too much to react to in front of an enemy, let the quiet sit a moment, and asked her the last question I actually needed answered. Where's Helena now? For the first time since I'd sat down, Elise smiled. Not the operator's smile from the mine, the one built to sell a lie. This one belonged to someone who just realized she had nothing left to protect, so she might as well spend what remained of it. Whatever composure had kept her steady through the mine had already spent itself. What replaced it looked less like fear now than relief. The specific relief of someone who no longer had to hold up a version of herself that was always going to fail eventually. She'd told me once, in the mine, that the world should hold nothing but beautiful things. Whatever she actually meant by that, Helena was apparently the only person she'd ever decided embodied it. She moved the moment I disappeared, she said. She always does. You won't find her. She'll find you. I didn't rise to it. She kept going anyway, like she'd been saving the rest for exactly this moment. She's been curious about you since the experiment data came back. She told me you were the only result she couldn't predict. Whatever tone she'd wrapped it in, that wasn't a compliment. It was Helena, speaking through her own lieutenant, telling me she already knew I was alive, knew roughly what I could do, and had decided I was worth watching rather than worth panicking over. A year ago, that would have meant she held every advantage. It didn't anymore. I'd died enough times already that being hunted didn't move much in me. It just meant I needed to move faster than she expected. Not that I needed to be afraid of her. Elise had given me everything she had left. Her usefulness to me was running out with the lamp oil, and she seemed to know it too. What happened to her after that was a question I hadn't answered yet, and I didn't plan to rush it. I found Elena at her desk long after the lamp in the interrogation room had burned down to nothing. Her office looked like a supply closet had lost an argument with a library. Stacked report scrolls, a wall map of the region gone soft at the corners, a cold cup of tea she'd clearly forgotten about twice. I bought boxed the whole case onto her desk in one motion: the ledger, the samples, the funding records, everything the mine and the lab beneath it had produced, and told her to hold it. "Not the authority," I said. "Not yet. When I need the government to actually act on this, I'll tell you, and you'll be the one who hands it over." She looked at the stack a long moment, then at me. "You have a plan for this." "Several," I said, "in the right order." She arched an eyebrow. "I've noticed you keep saying that. I've noticed it keeps being true." That drew something close to a laugh out of her, tired and real. The first unforced thing either of us had allowed all day. She asked what I meant to do about Elise. I told her the truth, that I hadn't decided yet, that a woman who talked this easily under the weight of a ledger would probably keep talking if the pressure ever changed shape, and that I wanted her held somewhere Helena couldn't reach before I closed that door for good. Elena didn't argue the point. She'd already arranged a cell 2 floors below with its own separate wards, well clear of the room holding the mine's evidence, and she told me that would hold for now. She just added the rest of it to the list she was already keeping for me, the same list that had the mine's evidence on it, and the guild's decline, and everything else I hadn't spent yet. What I still didn't have mattered just as much as what I'd gained. I didn't know where Helena would strike from, or when the tower's reopening actually landed on a calendar, or whether Silas even knew yet that his lieutenant's operation had been gutted out from under him. Elise had answered every question I'd known to ask. That still left the ones I hadn't thought of yet, and those were usually the ones that ended up mattering most. I left with more than I'd walked in with: a name for the money, Silas; a name for the reason, the Spires wards, and whatever waited behind them once they came down. And one thing that wasn't information at all, just a debt I'd been carrying since a mountain forest and hadn't known the shape of until that night. Helena's work had started on me, and Serena had signed the receipt for it. 2 targets now, instead of 1, and both of them standing somewhere on the road to the same tower. I'd run out of enemies before I ran out of patience. That was fine. I had time. The file was waiting on the table when I came down the next morning, thicker than the one I had carried out of that same room 2 nights before. Elena set a second cup of something hot beside it without being asked. She told me it was a copy of the Adventurers Authority's own hearing record rather than anything Elise had given us, and said getting it clean had cost her 3 favors she wasn't going to explain over breakfast. Then she left me alone with it, because some pages a person should read without anyone watching their face while they do it. The ruling itself was short, the way rulings usually are once a decision has already been made somewhere upstream of the words. Silver Feather's Emerald rank executives had been summoned before the authority to answer for a scout's death and 2 failed national contracts inside a single season. The board's finding was gross negligence. Effective immediately, Silver Feather's EX designation was revoked permanently, with no path to reinstatement for a decade. B rank certification was retained. The guild could keep operating, smaller now, and under a level of scrutiny it had never needed before, because nobody watches a guild that never loses. Serena had stood for the reading. The transcript noted only that she thanked the board for its time before she left the chamber, and that her composure hadn't changed once through the entire proceeding. I read that line twice, then a third time, because I wanted to be sure I wasn't imagining the flatness of it. A year of failure, a dead scout, an institution's trust gone in a single afternoon, and she had walked out the way she walked into everything, as if none of it had cost her a single thing worth mentioning. I set the ruling aside and reached for the pages underneath it. The ruling only told me what the authority had decided, months after the fact, from a room full of people who had never carried a bag for anyone in their lives. The pages underneath told me what had actually happened inside the guild, long before anyone outside its walls noticed there was anything worth investigating. I read slowly, the way I read anything that mattered, and the room stayed quiet around me except for the small sounds of paper and the occasional creak of the building settling into the morning. Elena's people were somewhere below, going about a normal working day, none of them knowing what I was sitting with 2 floors above their heads. I wanted to know exactly how it had happened before I let myself feel anything about the fact that it had. The record's first entry was a supply route through the northern wilderness, a monster den buried under permanent snow, taken on because it looked easy on paper to 3 people who had never once had to read the paper themselves. Silver Feather's 3 executives had never run a contract without a 4th pair of hands to carry the gear, pitch the camp, and cook whatever had actually been packed for them. This was their first time doing all of it on their own, and the snow told on them inside a single day. Victor carried nothing but his own spear and armor, on the grounds that a frontline fighter needed both hands free for whatever came at them them out of the white. Helena carried nothing at all, robed and imperious, even half frozen, reminding whoever would listen that a mage of her caliber moved as fast as any frontliner, and had said from the very first morning that hauling packs wasn't her work. Nathan agreed to read the map and then spent most of the march blaming the snow for making the map unreadable, which left the actual walking without anyone willing to lead it. 3 days in, none of them had eaten a proper meal. There was hardtack, and Helena wanted, in her own recorded words, warm soup and roast lamb. Victor wanted whoever had packed the supplies to have packed better, forgetting for the length of that complaint that the man who used to handle their supplies was a full year dead by then. Nobody scouted ahead. Scouting had always been the fourth pair of hands job too, and each of the three assumed one of the other two would notice trouble forming before it finished forming around them. 150 of them did the noticing instead. Stray wolves first, then silverfish swarming up through the snowpack, a witch throwing curses down from behind a ridge, pale things that blinked in and out of the whiteout like they had learned the trick from the cold itself. The three of them cut their way out because they were strong enough that fighting had never been the problem. Strength had never been the problem, not once, in the entire history of that guild. The record described the snow afterward as red for 100 paces in every direction. A line later, it described the three of them arguing over whose fault the delay had been, while the blood was still cooling. By the time the last of the pack broke off, the contract's clock had already run out under them. They walked home with a body count and no completed job to show for it, biting down on the specific kind of frustration that comes from winning a fight nobody made them have in the first place. Somewhere in those years, I had carried 100 packs through worse cold than that, without anyone asking how I managed the food or the map or the watch schedule. They had never needed to ask. That had been the entire arrangement. The next entry skipped ahead to the Guildmaster's chamber, high in Silverfeather's own tower, days after the three of them limped home from the snow with nothing to show the client but an apology. Serena heard the report in person. The record didn't describe her expression, only that she reminded them, gently, that she had asked before they left whether they would manage without a porter, and that both Victor and Helena had told her, confidently, that they would. She didn't raise her voice over the failure. She rarely raised her voice over anything. She told them she would overlook it this once, since it was still early days without him, and that for the next contract, she would assign someone new to handle the carrying and the scouting. Someone she said was more capable than the man they had lost. The record didn't note whether anyone in that room asked why she sounded so certain a replacement would be easy to find, or why, in an entire conversation built around the shape of his absence, she never once used his name. I noticed that part myself, reading it a year late in a quiet room that smelled of paper instead of snow. Nobody in the transcript did. I recognized the calm in it. It was the same calm I remembered from years of carrying that guild's gear myself, back when I still believed it meant something that she never raised her voice at me either. I understood it differently now, reading about a stranger's death recorded in her own even handwriting on the report's final line. It also explained something I had wondered about since a mountain forest and a bowl of tasteless soup. Helena had needed a first test subject long before she had a second facility to run proper trials in. Reading Serena's calm about a scout nobody would miss, I understood exactly why Serena had once been willing to hand her an old friend nobody would miss either. 1 week after that, a new scout walked into the Delta Basalt Zone with them, a young man half a year into Silverfeather's ranks, competent enough at reading rock and lava flow that he had been trusted with the job at all, despite how little the guild trusted anyone these days. He warned them, before they went in swinging, that the ground under a basalt shelf ahead was almost certainly a spawner, and that hitting it carelessly would wake more than 3 people could handle, no matter how strong those 3 people were. They hit it anyway. Victor's temper ran ahead of him the way it always had, ahead of anyone whose job it had once been to slow him down first, back when there had been someone whose job that was. The scout backed away from the shelf twice, the record noted, before Victor's spear went into it a third time out of pure irritation at being told to wait. The shelf came apart, the spawner woke, and inside a minute, the 3 of them were fighting a swarm with fire under it instead of frost. The same shape of trouble as the snow, dressed differently, lit orange instead of white. They survived it. Executives like that always survived the fight itself. Once the swarm was down, the scout made them mistake of pointing out that he had told them so, and used a phrase for what they were that the record kept intact, word for word. Strong, he called them, but trash underneath it. Victor's spear answered before anyone could stop him, and whatever the spear left unfinished, Helena's magic finished cleanly enough that there was nothing left afterward for another guild, or the authority, or anyone at all to go looking for. The contract failed a second time. The guild's official report blamed the spawner for everything. It didn't mention the scout at all, because by the time anyone outside that canyon thought to ask, there was no longer a scout left for anyone to ask about. The rest of the file read the same story on repeat for most of a year. Different dungeons, different commissions, the same 3 names refusing in turn to be the one who lifted the bags. More than once, the record simply noted a job abandoned at the entrance, gear stacked at a threshold, 3 executives standing over it in silence, waiting for someone else to carry it, until the waiting itself became the failure worth logging. Silverfeather never lost a fight that entire year. It just stopped finishing what it started, one unclaimed bag at a time, until there was nothing left of the EX rank to protect and nobody left to blame but each other. I closed the file and sat with it a while before I let myself think anything about it at all. The records room was quiet enough that I could hear the building settle around me, and I used the quiet for exactly as long as I needed it, which turned out to be longer than I expected. They took something from me that had a name, and it was called the years I spent carrying them, and the faith I put in the assumption that people who let you carry their weight were at least watching to see if you got tired, and the specific silence of a childhood friend who smiled when she let go of a living person. And the name of all of that was not revenge. It was the fact that it had mattered, and the fact that they had proven it did not, and the fact that I was going to spend the rest of my life knowing both things at once. I let that sentence finish itself all the way through, once, without cutting it off partway the way I usually did with anything that felt like feeling something. My hands were flat on the table the whole time, and I noticed, distantly, that they hadn't moved. Then, I put the feeling away the same as everything else, folded it down small, and let the flatness come back over it like water closing over a stone. It was still down there. It would still be down there in 10 years. I had learned to walk on top of things like that instead of waiting for them to dissolve. I put the file back in its folder and squared the corners the way Elena kept everything squared. Then I went to find her, because there was still work in front of me that a closed folder wasn't going to finish on its own, and because Elise was still waiting on a promise I intended to keep exactly as I'd made it. Ellie was waiting outside the cell when I got down there, arms crossed, having already heard from Elena that this would likely be the last conversation with Elise worth having. She hadn't said much to me since the night I came back from the first round of questions, and she hadn't asked where I disappeared to most days since, either. She came down for this one anyway. She usually did, when it mattered, whether or not I had told her it did. Elise looked smaller than she had the first time I stood in front of her, though nothing about her restraints had changed, and nothing about her burns had healed. She gave up what was left without much resistance now. A second facility, north of the capital, still fully stocked and still running. The date of the Black Obsidian Spire's reopening ceremony, 6 weeks out from that afternoon. After that, she said, there was nothing left in her worth taking. She said it with something close to relief. How many are still in that second building? Ellie asked her. Elise's answer was the same shrug she had given every question about the people she had already used up. Useful or discarded. I never saw much difference between the two. Ellie's hand found the doorframe hard enough that I heard it from where I stood. I knew exactly which word had done it. Someone had used that same word on her once, at an auction block, years before either of us had a say in anything, and she had never once repeated it to me herself. She didn't need to. I watched her hear it land on somebody else, and understood I was watching an old wound get touched, not a new one being made. I didn't raise my voice at either of them. She had been useful and thoroughly, and I told her so before I left the cell. I wasn't sure what she had expected to happen after that. Gratitude, maybe. It wasn't coming, and some part of her must have known that even while she was still hoping otherwise. We brought Elise back to the Redstone mine that evening, to the same chamber she had built for her own research, because what came next needed equipment that didn't exist anywhere else in the kingdom. 37 names were still logged in her own ledger under that chamber's registry, each one a person she had fed into the same machine for Helena's benefit. Each one was a name she had apparently found easy enough to write down and move past without a second thought. I read every one of those names before I touched anything else in that room, because I wanted the count to be mine too, not only hers. It felt like the least I owed the 37 of them, even if none of them would ever know I had done it. I didn't heal what the lava zone had left on her skin. I had never promised to. What I had promised her weeks earlier was that I would keep my word regardless of who I was keeping it to. And my word had only ever covered what happened to her body. It never covered what happened to her freedom afterward. And she knew that, even if she had chosen not to think about it until the chamber was standing open in front of her. Elise understood what it was for before I said a single word. She had built it herself. Her composure went first, and then her voice went with it. She wanted to know if there was some other arrangement, anything else. If I understood exactly what I was about to do to her. I understood exactly what I was about to do to her. That was the entire point of doing it. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, aware that I was about to become the kind of man who decided this. I was just as aware that I had already decided it the moment I read the 37th name. There wasn't a version of the next few minutes where I got to be both careful and merciful. I had made my choice about which of those two mattered more a long time ago, somewhere in a mountain forest, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise now for my own comfort. I didn't watch the part that mattered. I set the chamber to run the process on its own terms, the same terms her ledger described using on 37 other people who had never once gotten a say in it either. Then I stepped back and let her own machine finish what she had built it to do. When it was done, the chamber had a new occupant. She was no longer shaped the way she had walked in, and she would never again serve Helena's network as an eye, a voice, or a face that anyone would recognize on sight. I sealed the chamber the way her own notes described sealing it, and I didn't stay to watch what she did with whatever she had left of herself in that first hour. The lamps hummed the way they always had. The ash smell was the same. Nothing in that room had changed except the one thing that mattered. Ellie stood very still in the doorway the whole time, and when I finally looked at her, she didn't ask if I had felt anything doing it. She already knew the answer was that I hadn't felt enough, and that this would be true again before Helena was finished, and probably again after that. She took my hand anyway, on the walk back up out of the mine, into air that didn't smell like ash and old chemicals. Neither of us said another word about the chamber the rest of that night, and I was grateful for that more than I would have known how to say out loud. Elena was still awake when I got back, working through correspondence that could easily have waited until morning. I set the second facility's location and the spire's reopening date on her desk in place of the file I had returned that same morning, a full life ago by the feel of it. Helena's the primary target now, I said. The tower reopening is the window. I need 6 weeks. She didn't ask why the number mattered, only what she could do to help me close it. What do you need from me? She asked, setting down her pen. Keep Ellie safe. I didn't sit down. And start teaching her everything. Elena went quiet a moment, studying me the way she did when she already knew something I hadn't said out loud yet. She's been studying on her own for months, she told me. She never mentioned it to you. I know. I let that sit a second before I finished it. Teach her faster. Elena didn't ask how I knew. She never did, when the answer would have cost either of us something to say out loud in a room this quiet. She just nodded, poured out 2 cups of something warm that neither of us got around to finishing, and told me 6 weeks was more time than she had expected anyone to give me. It was more time than I had expected too. Helena had a head start, a network, and old data on a test subject who used to be too weak to fight back in a mountain forest. Silver Feather had fallen without ever learning why. Helena was not going to get that same mercy. Whatever her records told her about who I used to be, she had 6 weeks left to find out how wrong they were, and I intended to spend every hour of it making sure she found out in person. 6 weeks was still 6 weeks, however I meant to spend them. Wren had the land papers on my desk within 2 days of my asking for them. A windswept stretch the locals called Pumpkin Plateau. Cheap because nothing grew there, and the nearest good road was half a day's ride away. That suited me. I wasn't buying it for the road. Land without people on it is just dirt with a fence around it. Before I laid a single block, I took the 2-day cart ride south to Walwright, a market town that did brisk business in things nobody wanted looked at too closely, and went to the part of it that never gets mentioned at a guild counter. I'd spent years being the quiet one who did what he was told, and it had gotten me thrown into a pit to die. I wasn't building a home for more people like that. I wanted the ones who'd already said no and meant it. The trader running that stretch of tunnel wore a carved wooden mask and laughed at his own jokes before I'd finished hearing them. He'd heard about the coin I'd been spending around Walwright and wanted a piece of it, and he made no effort to hide that. He led me down a spiral stair into a room lined with cages, the air thick with old stone and unwashed cloth, and something underneath both that I didn't want to name. Most of the people in the cages watched me the way prey watches something that might not have noticed them yet, quiet, careful, hoping hoping to be overlooked. One wasn't. A half-beast woman, 19, stood at the front of her cage instead of the back. Her collar had been refitted 4 times, a fresh scar of metal each time. 4 different owners who'd each given up on her in turn. She met my eyes and didn't look away first. "I'm told you've been returned 4 times for refusing to comply," I said. She didn't blink. "Yes." "Good. I meant it. I need people who refuse to comply with things they shouldn't comply with. Come or don't. There's no obligation." She laughed. Not the polite kind. The kind that startles the person doing it, like it had been sitting unused so long it came out rusty at the hinges. She clapped a hand over her own mouth halfway through it, like laughing was something that got you punished where she'd come from, then let it out anyway. The trader supplied her name the way he'd supply a price. Asha. A second woman had been watching the whole exchange from a corner, arms folded, saying nothing until Asha laughed. A dark elf, 19, never sold in her life. Not because nobody wanted her, but because every buyer who'd looked twice had walked away rather than deal with the racial talk it would bring back home. She'd been standing in that corner longer than anyone else in the room. Arms still folded, she said. "You gave the beast girl a choice." I did. "Is that a technique?" "No," I said, and left it there. "Then I'll come." I hadn't asked her. "I know," she said, before I could point that out. "That's why I'm choosing." The trader called her Mina. I paid him more than either of them was worth on his own ledger, burned both collars off with a box that held nothing but fire, and handed them clothes that weren't rags. Neither one asked what came next before agreeing to find out. I decided I liked them both for that. We left through the same spiral stair we'd come down. Asha blinked hard in the daylight at the top, like she hadn't stood in open sun for a while. Mina didn't blink at all. Neither of them asked where we were going. I told them anyway. On the walk out of Walrite, land, a house, a garden, nobody's orders to follow but their own good sense. Asha laughed again, shorter this time, like she was testing whether the first one had been a mistake. It hadn't been. We reached the plateau at first light. Asha walked the boundary line twice before she said anything, like she was checking for the trick. Mina stood at the edge and looked at the empty grass the way a person looks at a blank page they don't quite trust yet. The inscription carved into the abyss stone, back when I was falling toward what I thought was my death, had promised a garden for the burden. I hadn't thought about those words in a long time. Standing on bare ground with nothing built on it yet, I thought about them again. I laid the foundation first, cutting stone into level courses faster than any crew of masons could have managed, because I wasn't cutting anything. I was placing blocks that already existed, whole in my head, the way I'd been placing them since a cave floor was the only thing I trusted under my feet. Every piece of it came out of an inventory I'd filled the hard way, in a nether fortress and a mineshaft and a dozen places I'd nearly died. And none of that mattered to the wall going up now, except that it was mine to spend. Then the perimeter wall, built out of the darkest stone I'd carried up out of the nether, stone that nothing native to this world could crack. Then the shelter frames, one after another, 30 of them, small and plain and dry, laid out in rows with room to breathe between them, each one with a door that locked from the inside and nowhere else. Then a central hall, large enough to hold more people than were standing on the plateau yet, because I intended to fill it. Then a well dug straight down to clean water, a watermill fitted to the stream at the edge of the property, an irrigation channel cut from the same stream to the garden plots, and fences to keep the local wildlife honest. Asha watched most of it without speaking, which I was starting to understand was how she paid attention. Mina asked one question, how long the wall would hold, and filed the answer away without comment. "Are you doing this for everyone you find in a market?" Asha asked on the second day, watching the central hall take shape. "For whoever wants it," I said. "Nobody stays here who doesn't ask to." She didn't answer that, but she stopped asking questions like she was waiting for the catch. I planted the first plot with pumpkins, because Ellie had mentioned once, months ago in passing, that pumpkin soup was the first warm thing she remembered eating. I didn't tell her that was the reason. I told myself it was efficient ground cover. 4 days in, the plateau looked like somewhere people actually lived instead of somewhere I'd only just built. 30 units stood in rows behind the wall. The central hall was finished, doors hung and swinging true. Pumpkin vines were already reaching for the fence line in the garden plots, faster than anything should grow in 4 days, which was the one part of this Hakoniwa couldn't fully explain, and I'd stopped questioning. Asha climbed onto the wall and sat with her legs hanging over the drop. looking out at land that was, as far as either of us understood the arrangement, actually hers to stand on now. Mina walked the length of the central hall twice, running one hand along the beams like she didn't trust wood that hadn't been paid for in blood. By the second pass, she'd stopped checking and started arranging where the first arrivals would sleep, which told me more about her than anything she'd said at the market. Asha didn't look over. Nobody's going to take this from us. Not while I'm breathing, I said. Neither of them thanked me for it. I hadn't built the place to be thanked for. I'd built it because the inscription in that abyss stone had made a promise on my behalf before I even knew what I wanted. And this was the first time I'd had the standing to make good on it. Asha picked the shelter frame closest to the wall for herself, and Mina picked the one beside it without discussing it. And that was the whole conversation either of them needed to have about it. Neither one had ever had a room with a lock that answered to them, and no one else. Now they did. Rory had spent every visit I'd made to Electrobrave being the background noise to whatever Elena and I were actually discussing. Filing forms, tripping over furniture, laughing at things before anyone finished saying them. She was stacking request forms behind the front desk when I told her I needed someone to run the plateau while I was away at the tower. She dropped the whole stack. I thought you'd never ask me to do anything important. It is, I said. The people out there can't protect themselves yet, and I won't be able to protect them from where I'm going. That makes this the most important thing I've handed to anyone, you included. She stopped smiling, which for Rory was the more honest expression. I understand. I gave her the list I'd been keeping since the first collar came off. Who needed watching? Who flinched at raised voices? Who Asha had already flagged as not ready to be trusted near a blade? Rory read it twice, without a single joke. She didn't ask what the tower was, or why it mattered, or when I'd be back. She set the forms aside for someone else to finish, and went. Ellie walked the garden the morning we were set to leave for the tower approach, her pack already over one shoulder. She stopped at the pumpkin plot and stood there long enough that I noticed her noticing. You remembered, she said. I file most things, I said. I know. She didn't ask why the pumpkins, specifically, mattered enough to plant first. She already knew, and saying it out loud would have made both of us deal with what that meant. Months of training under Elena had put a straighter set in her shoulders than the girl I'd pulled out of a burning port town used to have. She still stood in front of that plot like it belonged to her, the way nothing in her life ever had before me. She took my hand, just for a moment, then let go and walked on ahead of me toward the gate, toward the cart, and the road, and however many weeks were left before the spire reopened. Helena still didn't know where I was, which was the only advantage I meant to keep holding until we got there. I hadn't built the garden for anyone's benefit, I was ready to admit to, but it was there anyway, and she knew it, and that was going to have to be enough for both of us going forward. We had been 11 days in Chaldea, waiting on the spire's survey window, and taking whatever odd work the town needed done while we waited, when the horn sounded from the north gate and did not stop. Elena had already gone ahead of us to the capital to arrange things for the survey. Ellie had spent the 11 days trading books with a librarian named Lucy, who adored her, and getting a formal nod from a dwarf blacksmith who did not, and I had let myself get comfortable in a town that knew my face. I should have known better than to enjoy that. Ellie was at my side before I'd finished turning toward the horn. Fogg was already at the gate, a short, stout man with a voice built for shouting over crowds, waving the non-fighters back with both arms. Cover, all of you. Melee to the front. Block what you can. Mages, hold until I say. He caught sight of us, and some of the tension went out of his shoulders, though not all of it. Adrian, good. We've got trouble. How many? Don't know yet. Sounds like plunderers. The word came out of him like a curse he'd hoped never to use again. We're down to stone and iron rank standing here tonight. Every gold-ranked sword we had left for the capital 2 months back, and our merchant lord and his mercenaries only just rode out this morning. Convenient timing for somebody. I didn't ask who benefited. I already knew. Those gold ranks had been drawing quiet coin off a smuggling arrangement tied to Helena's people, and once I'd torn that arrangement apart, their reason to stay in Chaldea went with it. Fogg saw the thought cross my face anyway. It's been nothing but changes since you came through here, he said. Not quite an accusation. Gold ranks gone. Certain customers dried up overnight, but you did well cleaning the trash out of this town, and I won't lay what's left of it at your feet tonight. Hearing it said kindly didn't make the guilt smaller. I filed it away. There wasn't time for it yet, and knelt to put a bare hand flat against the ground. The earth answered the way it always did, patient and exact. 13 bodies, moving in from 4 directions at once, in a pattern built by something that had done this before and knew how a town like this one would break. I raised shields where the beginners stood, stone rising into their hands in one motion before they'd finished flinching at the horn. Hold here. Let them close before you loose anything. Fogg nodded like I'd told him the sky would hold. Ellie touched my arm. The east gate's thinner. I'll go with Fog. I wanted to tell her to stay where I could watch her. I didn't. She wasn't asking permission, and we both knew it. Go, I said. I'll find you. She was already moving. Beyond the wall, the light was going the color of old copper, and I found the first of them by the shape it made against the smoke. Armored, crocodile-jawed, built along the lines of a man who'd spent too long in a swamp and liked what it did to him. A vindicator. Half a year ago, I would have run from something that size and been sensible for doing it. Now, I mostly wanted it to hold still. I poured mana into the ground instead of my hands. The dirt around its feet answered before it finished turning its head. An intense catastrophe put 6 spears of stone through it from underneath in a single breath. That left the witch, further back, already fumbling a potion loose from her belt. Whatever was in it wouldn't save her from something she couldn't name in time. I laced fire through light before she got the cork fray. Vortex high laser, a kind of magic that isn't supposed to exist as one spell. And the beam went through her and kept going, scorching a line into the trees behind her that was still burning when I looked back. A thin bar of light flickered at the edge of my vision when the spell finished. Something new I hadn't noticed there before. I didn't have time for it either. I filed it away on top of the guilt and went looking for the rest. I found the trail the last of them had cut through the brush, heading toward the east gate, toward Ellie. I ran. The bell tower was already down when Ellie and Fog reached the east gate, sawn through at the base rather than fallen by accident. Whoever had planned this had known exactly what that bell would have cost them. The same way they'd known which morning the mercenaries would be gone and which merchant kept his guards underground. Fog kept the townspeople moving toward the cellars, ignoring the ones shouting for Adrian instead of listening to him. One man grabbed his sleeve. "What good is she going to do us?" he said, jerking his chin at Ellie. A slip of a girl with a bow. Ellie didn't answer him. She was already counting shapes coming out of the tree line, too many of them, closing from 3 sides at once while conch shells sounded somewhere behind them. The first bolt took her in the right shoulder before she'd finished knocking her own arrow. She didn't go down. She didn't make a sound. She planted her back foot, threw both hands up instead of reaching for the wound, and pulled 6 months of secret training into a barrier of ice that spread over the crowd behind her, like a roof made of frozen air, blue-white and humming with the strain of holding. Arrows shattered against it in one wave, then a second, then a third. She held it there on her feet with a crossbow bolt still buried in her shoulder, breathing in short, careful pulls, never once turning to see whether it had worked. She didn't need to look. She could hear that it had. I came through the gate in time to see the barrier still holding, and the last of the plunderers breaking cover for one more volley. I put them down with a single strike before the first arrow left a string. Catastrophe again, quieter this time, because nothing was left standing to make noise afterward. The ice went out the second the threat did, like it had only ever been holding on for the fight's sake and not a moment longer. Ellie's knees buckled. I reached her before she hit the ground. The bolt was still lodged in her shoulder, dark against the pale blue of the fading barrier light. She hadn't made a sound about it. Not to Fog, not to the crowd she'd been shielding. Not even now, with me kneeling in front of her and her blood soaking into my sleeve. I boxed the shaft out clean, one motion, no room for her to brace against it, and pressed my palm hard over the wound. I had taught myself a long time ago not to make sounds when I was hurt. I hadn't known she'd taught herself the same lesson on her own, without me ever showing her how, until I was the one holding the evidence of it shut with my hand. "Sorry for the wait," I said. She looked at me like she'd known I was there before she'd seen me. "You're not late." Her voice came out thinner than usual, but steady under it. "I've been waiting for you since the moment I was born." I didn't have an answer worth saying out loud. I don't think she wanted one. I kept the pressure on her shoulder and let her lean her weight into me instead of the wall, and I stayed exactly there, not moving, until Fog came running with bandages and someone who knew how to use them. I left Ellie in careful hands and went looking for whoever had planned this, because plunderers don't smuggle a curse stone past a town's inspectors and saw down a bell tower on their own initiative. Someone had walked them in. I found him 2 streets over, still talking, though his men were already dead around him. I'd gone through them on the way past without slowing down, and he hadn't noticed yet. He was giving orders to nobody now. Kill the men left standing. Collar the women for sale. Let the rumors land on me once it was done. He noticed me on the word rumors. "There are 2 things I don't forgive," I told him, before he'd finished deciding whether to run. "Evil that gets to walk around unpunished, and people who damage what's mine. Borrowed toys, hand-me-down clothes, a sword somebody stole off me once, a town I've been living in for 11 days. Wind gathered hard around my fist. an old trick Gale had taught me the shape of. Tonight, you managed all 4. I hit him 57 times. I counted, because counting kept me from doing worse than that. When he could still hear me, I tied him with his own belt and crouched down to his level. His bravado had gone somewhere else entirely by then. Tell whoever sent you, and someone sent you, that if this town or that girl get touched again, I'll make the word hell mean something new for them. I stood. Go on. Crawl. He crawled. The beginners at the main gate were nearly finished when I got back. Mana gone, arrows gone, one boy holding a shield with both arms shaking, and every one of them still standing because nobody had told them they were allowed to stop. A second wave had come in behind the first, gold rank monsters that should have needed a dozen seasoned adventurers to hold. And these 6 had managed it for the better part of an hour on nothing but Fogg's orders and pure stubbornness. I went through what was left of the horde faster than I'd gone through anything else that night. It wasn't difficult. It only needed doing before any of them collapsed doing it for me. They looked at me after like I'd stepped out of one of Lucy's old picture books. One girl asked, only half joking, whether I took applications. Another just stood there with tears running down a face still streaked in soot. Somebody was already humming something that sounded like it wanted to become a song by morning. Somebody started calling me the town's hero before the fires had even finished dying down. It moved faster than I expected. One of the beginners telling a neighbor, the neighbor telling 3 more, until by the time I'd wiped the blood off my sword, the name had already outrun me through half of Chaldea. It was a strange thing to be called, for a man who used to spend his days carrying other people's luggage. Nobody mentioned the shape that had watched all of it from somewhere above the smoke, and left before anyone thought to look up. I only heard about that later. At the time, I had a girl with a hole in her shoulder to get back to. They'd cleaned the wound and wrapped it properly by the time I sat down beside her. Ellie kept her eyes on the lamp instead of on me, which was how I knew she had something to ask. Did I do it right? She still wasn't looking at me. The barrier. I'd never tested it against a real volley before tonight. It held everyone behind it, I said. Nobody back there got so much as scratched. Good. She let her eyes close, finally, like she'd been keeping them open on purpose, until she heard exactly that. Good. I sat with her while her breathing evened out. 6 months she'd carried the not knowing, whether the spell would hold, whether she'd hold, whether the day would come and she'd freeze instead of the arrows. And she'd never once told me she was building it. Tonight, she'd found out, in front of a whole town instead of just me, and she hadn't needed rescuing to do it. The weight of not knowing was finished now. She could afford to be tired. Fogg knocked once to say the town wanted to hold some kind of gathering in my name by morning. I told him it could wait. Ellie's shoulder would take a few weeks before she could draw a bow again, and the spire's window was down to 3 weeks now, closing on us whether we were ready or not. I sat with her until the lamp burned low, thinking that somewhere out past the wall, whoever had sent Brock now knew for certain that I was watching for them just as hard as they'd been watching this town. I was still thinking about the weight she'd finally set down when she fell asleep against my shoulder, and I let her. Ellie's shoulder had healed slower than either of us liked. 3 weeks of rest measured against a spire window that kept shrinking whether we were ready for it or not. I'd already spent my last diamond and obsidian building an enchantment table and putting luck the 3rd tier onto my guild insignia, a small bet on the version of me that kept getting lucky. Today's bet was smaller and a lot more personal. Ellie stood at the workbench, turning a bow over in her hands. Netherwood, black and heavier than ordinary wood, had any right to be. You said this rune only goes on bows. That's the only shape it accepts, I said. Infinite dross. No arrows to carry, none to run out of. She didn't ask for permission the way she usually did. She just told me, I want it. I've been training with Elena, in secret. I wanted to be good enough before I said anything, that she'd hidden it for months and was only telling me now, holding out an old debt she'd never once asked me to repay. That landed harder than the bow did. Your shoulder isn't ready for a real draw, I said. 1 test shot. That's what you get today. She took the shot. It went exactly where she aimed it. Neither of us said anything else. Neither of us needed to. Ren had the carriage moving before the sun cleared the horizon. A cheap frame he'd swapped in after the raid, so nobody looked twice at us. He drove. Elena and Ellie rode in back with me, and I spent most of the trip with a runebook open on my knee instead of talking. Ren tried anyway. Not only summoning, but half a menagerie of familiars besides. I'd love to know what kind of training teaches a man that many arts at once. He's meditating, Elena said, before I had to invent an answer. Let him be. It wasn't meditation. It was survival. Working out what the coins I kept spending were actually buying me, because whatever waited at the spire wasn't going to slow down while I caught up. The tower came into view before the town did, a black spike driven into the desert like something had planted it there on purpose, mana rolling off it heavy enough to feel from miles out. Elena laid out the shape of the expedition without being asked, a noble-backed rearguard riding in comfort behind an expendable vanguard of guild adventurers sent ahead to find out what killed them first. We were vanguard. I intended to stay forgettable inside it. Somewhere past that spire was Silas, the man Elise had named months back as the one funding Helena's work. I didn't know yet what he looked like. I went back to the runebook and let that question wait its turn. Bezoria was the last town before the spire. Sandstone walls carved with bone and geometric patterning, more prosperous than a desert town had any right to be. Ren peeled off toward a merchant meeting the moment we arrived, already talking logistics before he was out of the carriage. The inn he'd booked had no rooms left. A rear guard unit, Noble's private soldiers, had arrived 2 days early and taken every bed in town. Is the point to exhaust the vanguard before we even reach the gates? I asked Elena, already knowing. Exactly, she said. Wear us down so we can't produce results, and we withdraw on our own instead of getting sent home in disgrace. Ellie answered before I finished the next thought, so they never have to admit they pushed us out. I didn't know if the nobles who jumped the schedule answered to Silas directly. I intended to find out. For now, it just meant one more night without walls. We were still deciding where to camp when the shouting started. 2 women were backed against the inn's outer wall by 4 men in private house colors, one reaching for a red-haired woman's arm, while a second, quieter woman in a hooded cloak stood rigid beside her. "Don't touch me," she wrenched her arm free. "Who'd want your stinking help?" One of the men told the others to just drag her out by force, and reached again. I didn't decide to help so much as notice my hand had already shaped the wind. A gust caught all 4 men's ankles at once and put them flat on the ground, hard enough to knock the confidence out of them. I was gone before they got back up, telling myself it hadn't cost me anything. We picked a stretch of open rock past the last wall, and I got to work before full dark. No inn meant no walls, so I made my own. Down instead of out, 3 rooms cut from the hardpan and braced smooth with boxed stone, a shaft for air, an entrance that didn't announce itself from the road. 6 hours, start to finish. Ellie was already unpacking bedrolls into the second room before I'd finished sealing the first ceiling seam. Halfway through smoothing the last wall, the ground told me 2 people were coming, blurred at the edges the way something moved when it was hidden inside mirage magic. I let them get close enough to be sure, then went up to open the door before they had to knock. It was the 2 women from the inn. The red-haired one had her jaw set like she'd argued with herself the whole way here. The other, still hooded, said nothing at all. "Found you." She planted her hands on her hips. "You're the one who tripped those idiots." "Thanks. I would have handled it myself, but she insisted." "I wanted to thank you properly," the hooded one said, quiet under the other one's noise. In person, Elena watched both of them with the particular stillness she got when she already knew something the rest of us didn't. "Lena, that was her name," she announced, dropping into the only chair like she owned it. "Got straight to business. Form a party with us. Guaranteed pass on the tower exam. Good deal, right? No benefit to us," I said. "Don't be cold." She grinned like refusal was a game she expected to win eventually. Elena leaned toward me and lowered her voice, though not low enough that the other 2 couldn't hear it if they wanted to. "These 2 will matter to you later. I'd stake my intuition on it." Elena's intuition had been right about people before. I told Lena I'd listen, nothing more, and that I wasn't handing over anything about us in return. The hooded one pushed her hood back once we were sealed underground. Under it was hair so pale a blue it looked poured from glass, and beneath her collar sat a crest worked in silver that caught the lamplight. "I owe you an apology for the disguise," she said. "I am the first princess of Batland. My name is Nora." Nobody moved for a second. Lena didn't look surprised, only resigned, like she'd known this moment was coming and hadn't looked forward to it. Nora didn't wait for a reaction. "I'm traveling without guard because the border authority answers to men I can't trust. I have reason to believe the same corruption reaches all the way to the tower. I can't bring what I know forward alone. I've heard what they call you. I'm asking for help." I let that sit for a second. "You didn't have to tell me who you were to ask for that. I know. I'm telling you because it's the only thing I have that you might actually value. It's the right thing to bring," I said, and meant it. Lena stood before anyone could call it settled. "Words are cheap. I want to see what you've got." She nodded at my empty hands. "You don't even carry a sword." I didn't need one. I boxed a length of wallstone into a blade-shaped edge and let her come at me 3 times. Each swing met stone, not skin. On the 4th, she overcommitted, and I stepped past her guard and laid the flat of the stone against her throat without touching her. She looked at the blade a long moment. "That's not a sword." "No," I said. She sheathed her own and didn't argue further. She had good instincts. She'd recognized a different kind of careful the moment she met it. 4 allies now, sealed in a hole in the ground 200 meters from a tower that hadn't let anyone question it yet. Whatever waited inside that black spire was going to have to deal with more than just me. Lena waited until the door sealed behind us before she said the part she'd clearly been sitting on all evening. The exam waiting for us at the spire wasn't a real gate at all. She said it plain. Every guild would be tested tomorrow against 2 royal examiners in front of the whole camp, and every guild would believe the results decided who got in. Hers didn't. She and Nora had people planted on the royal side with enough rank to wave any name they wanted through, exam or no exam, and they'd planned to use exactly that. So skip the theater, I said. Nobody needs to watch me lose on purpose. I told them my plan instead, the one I'd already built into the ground under our feet without telling anyone. I could dig straight past the barrier the same hour it dropped for the survey crews, walk the 4 of us in from underneath, and never once stand in that line at all. Lena's mouth actually fell open. That's obviously impossible. You don't just tunnel under a state ward like it's garden soil. I didn't answer that. I'd tunneled under worse. Nora didn't argue at all. She turned it over once, the way she turned over everything, then nodded like the matter was closed. As long as we get inside, I don't care how ugly it looks getting there. A small, tired smile. That stubborn streak of yours. You really are your father's son. That was a question for a day I hadn't earned yet, and I let it go instead of chasing it. Ellie watched the whole exchange without a word, the way she did when she was deciding whether something mattered. She decided this one did. I saw her mark it and file it away for later, same as I would have. We spent the rest of the night going over what waited on the other side of that barrier, and how little any of us actually knew about it. We reached the camp the next day, and there were more people crammed into it than I'd seen in one place since Chaldea. Heat came up off the packed sand in visible waves, and the air smelled like canvas and pack animals, and too many people rationing too little water. Tents, a wood-framed clinic, a stone storehouse built fast and ugly against the heat. Someone had thrown this place together in a hurry to hold every guild in the region that thought it had a shot at the spire. All these people are challengers? Ellie asked, watching a knot of adventurers shove past a supply cart. The higher the danger, the bigger the dream, Lena said. It's a hell and a treasure mountain both. Cut it off to one day only, and every single-minded fool in the kingdom tries to force their way through at once. I believed her. I'd been one of those fools once, minus the dream. It was Nora who finally said the name I'd been half expecting since the underground base. Silas, she told me, had already come to this land, was somewhere in this camp or the ruins beyond it right now, close enough to touch. I kept my face still and let the shock move through me privately instead of out loud. A year of practice had taught me that much. Elena wasn't as patient. If the great general is actually here, and this isn't just a theory you're chasing, she let the sentence hang a moment, watching Nora's face. I'd like to hear what grand evil he's supposedly planning. Lena had the answer ready. She'd traced the missing tax money herself, out of the national ledgers, into the pockets of nobles back in the capital, and from there, straight into the hands of people loyal to Helena and Elise. Right around the same weeks, Silas had personally convinced the king to stand his army down against the Silver Feather Guild. His agents had been meeting with Helena's. Nora admitted they had no single document that proved all of it at once. Nothing airtight enough to hand a magistrate without being laughed out of the room. The pattern held every time they traced it, though. That was the part that mattered. I said nothing about what the Silver Feather Guild was to me. That was a separate account, and I wasn't opening it here. Word moved through the camp before we'd finished talking. The Royal Battle Knights had arrived, along with the Court Magic Corps and one of the kingdom's 6 wise men, an old sage named Graf, to take direct control of the day's proceedings. Whatever this exam actually was, it had just gotten a much bigger audience. Graf walked us out himself, close to a kilometer of ruined ground between the camp and the cliff, where the spire actually stood. He read a report someone had handed him without breaking stride, bored with the whole errand, and said, mostly to himself, that 108 adventurers from 22 guilds had turned out for this. More than he'd expected, and more, his tone made clear, than the tower actually needed alive by evening. Nora and Lena stayed hooded at the edges of the crowd, invisible on purpose. Whatever a princess and a knight captain of Batland were worth here, it wasn't worth spending on a guild exam. Elena and I stood as our own guild's face instead. A woman near the front of the crowd went down before the test even started. knees folding, a wooden staff clattering against stone. She hadn't slept the night through, I'd learn later, and hadn't eaten a proper meal in longer than that. She pushed herself back upright anyway and told the people around her, more or less, that she wasn't giving up the one chance her guild had left to matter. I knew that voice, not hers specifically, the shape of it. I'd used it myself once, in a mountain forest, on tasteless soup and nothing else. "You all right?" I asked her. "I'm fine," she said, not looking at me. "Thank you." She wasn't fine. I let it go, because pushing would have cost her the one thing she still had, which was choosing this herself. Graf called for one Emerald rank representative from every guild to step forward. 44 of us lined up along the barrier line while he introduced the two people we'd actually be fighting, a knight named Balzac Frygald and a court mage named Laishal. "Real soldiers," he said. "Not the guild kind we only pretended to resemble. Match either of them, and we earned the right to enter the tower. Fail, and we didn't." Then he retreated to a lookout post to watch the rest of it happen without him. Elena leaned in close enough that only I could hear her. "You're planning to lose on purpose," not a question. "Some part of you is going to enjoy watching these two think they earned that." "I have no intention of taking this seriously," I told her. She didn't believe me, and she wasn't wrong not to. Balzac and Laishal worked through the line without slowing. 8 representatives went in front of me and came out the other side beaten. 4 against his sword, 4 against her spellwork, none of them landing so much as a mark on either examiner. It stopped looking like a test somewhere around the 4th pair and started looking like an exhibition for an audience that hadn't asked to watch one. The exhausted woman went in 9th. Her guildmate, a younger woman everyone called Leah, never stopped arguing the whole time that their leader hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, shouldn't be doing this. But the officials running the line waved her off. The exam didn't pause for exhaustion any more than the tower would. She lasted longer than I expected, longer than most of the 8 before her, staff shaking in both hands by the end of it. It still wasn't enough. Laishal put her down without much effort and stood over her afterward, telling her, plainly, without heat, that she'd had her warning, and this was the last one. "Give up on the tower. Go home." The woman didn't get up. Laishal raised her hand anyway and started building something bigger, enough force gathering in it that the air around her fingers actually bent. She wasn't finishing a test anymore. She was making an example. I stepped past the line before I'd decided to. Whatever she meant to drop on that half-conscious woman, I'd already reached into the air and taken it before it landed. The whole spell gathered into my hand like I'd picked an apple off a branch instead of catching fire. It simply wasn't there anymore. Laishal's hand stayed raised over nothing. "That's enough waiting," I told her. "Test us, if we've got the right to be here. Go on." Elena, beside me, didn't bother hiding how pleased she looked. Laishal looked at me the way people used to look at me when I was still carrying their bags. Like whatever I was, it didn't require her full attention. She called what I'd done a trick, said Mana Drain couldn't handle that many different kinds of magic at once, and told me she'd finish this in a single breath just to prove it. She didn't take a single breath. She sent 3 spells at once: a rope of fire twisting into the shape of snakes, a crack of lightning aimed low, and something pale that ate at the air itself instead of burning it. Any one of those would have ended most of the 43 people who'd gone before me. She threw all 3 together, which told me exactly how much she'd learned from watching me stand there and take the first one. I didn't dodge. There wasn't a reason to. I opened my hand the way I'd opened it on 1,000 blocks of stone and dungeon wall and Dead Man's sword, and I boxed all 3 of them out of the air before they finished forming. Not caught, not blocked. Taken? The way I took everything, folded down into something small enough to close a fist around. The fire went first, then the lightning, then the pale one, each collapsing into a shape I could hold. For 1 full second, I was carrying 3 separate deaths in one closed hand, and none of them could reach anyone anymore. Laishal's face went from certainty to something else in that same second. She threw more after it. Smaller spells, faster. Like speed was the thing I'd been missing, and I took every one of those too, until her breathing turned ragged and her knees started disagreeing with the rest of her. Nobody had ever told her what it costs a body to keep feeding a hole that doesn't fill. I watched her learn it in real time, the color leaving her face the same way it leaves anyone's when they run out of what they didn't know they'd been spending. She went down on one knee. The desert had gone very quiet behind me. No cheering, nobody speaking. 40-some exhausted representatives and one old sage on a lookout post, all watching the same thing happen at once. I thought for 1 full second about a mountain forest and tasteless soup, and a woman who used to test her spells on me because I was cheaper than a proper subject. I thought about a childhood friend who smiled while she let go of my hand over a hole with no bottom. Neither of them was standing in front of me right now. Only Laishal was, and Laishal had never done either of those things to me. But the crown she wore on her collar belonged to the same kind of world that had spent 20-some years deciding I didn't count. I didn't correct the thought. I let it sit there once, without filing it anywhere. Then I closed the last of what I'd taken from her into a single shape. Every spell she'd thrown at me folded together into one line of compressed light, and let it go low, deliberately low, close enough to graze her cheek and open a shallow line across it before it kept traveling and dug a scar into the stone floor behind her. She could have lost the whole side of her face. She lost a few inches of skin and her footing instead. That was the entire mercy in it, and it was exactly as much as I'd intended to give. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Graf, from his lookout post, asked quietly, in the tone of a man who already suspected the answer and wanted it said out loud anyway, who I actually was. I told him what I always told people who asked that question. A guild member, emerald rank, same as everyone else in that line, if a little luckier with his teachers. He didn't believe me. I could see it in the way he kept looking at the scorch mark I'd left in his floor instead of at me. He didn't push it either, which told me something about him worth remembering. Something shifted quietly in the box power itself while I stood there catching my own breath. A small acknowledgement, the kind I'd learned to recognize by now, that it had just learned to hold something it hadn't been able to hold yesterday. Spellwork now, not only stone and steel. That was one more thing it could do that it couldn't do the day before, and I set the thought aside the ordinary way, without ceremony, and turned to see to the woman still lying where Laishal had left her. By the time the barrier crews called an end to the day's testing, 17 people from guilds with no spies and no royal connections were lying broken somewhere along that line. I'd carried them down myself, one at a time, into a chamber I'd dug straight into the earth beneath the testing ground, while everyone else was still watching Laishal try to explain herself to Graf. Nora healed what she could of the worst of it. The woman who'd refused my help earlier woke up confused, staring at packed dirt walls lit by a block of stone that glowed like it had swallowed a lamp. Leah crouched beside her before she could panic. "This is somewhere he made with earth magic," Leah said. "He carried you here. She healed you." A nod toward Nora. "You're fine. Everyone's fine." "I'm Rosalind," the woman finally managed, sitting up despite everything her body clearly wanted. "Saravi Chronicles. You didn't have to do any of this. You all were never meant to pass that test today," I told her. "So I'm giving you the chance they made sure you wouldn't get. There's a way under this barrier when it drops tonight. You're welcome to take it with us." Rosalind pushed herself fully upright before she answered. "If we run now, we're already dead, just slower. Facing the thing in front of you is what a guild is supposed to mean." She looked at the 6 or 7 others stirring around her, all of them listening. "We're going." Nobody argued with her, not even the ones still holding their ribs. Lena watched all of it with her arms crossed, the way she'd watched most things since the underground base. "Why'd you help them?" she asked me, quiet enough that it was really just for me, all of them, not just the useful ones. "Good bait," I said. 17 extra bodies between us, and whatever's waiting past that barrier. Elena laughed once, short and knowing. "There's no shame in just saying you felt for people who never got a fair shot to begin with, Adrian." She didn't wait for me to argue. She already knew I wasn't going to. Ellie didn't say anything at all. She didn't need to. She'd understood the reason before I finished the sentence. The same way she understood most things about me before I said them out loud. The barrier came down at the hour Graf's people had announced, thin enough for a few careful hours that the survey teams could move through it from above. We moved through it from below instead. 20 some of us single file down a passage I'd cut straight through packed earth and old stone, following the cold draft that meant open space ahead. Something was already loose in that draft. A shape came low and fast out of the dark near the tunnel's mouth, one of whatever the barrier had been built to keep contained in the first place, and it went for the nearest body in line before any of us had drawn a weapon. Ellie already had. The infinite bow I'd made her didn't need a quiver, and it didn't need her at full strength either. One arrow, drawn and loosed before I'd finished turning around, dropped the thing 3 strides short of Leah. "Good shot," I said. She didn't lower the bow until she was sure. I know. We came out into the base of the tower a few minutes later, Rosalind's people fanning out behind us. Quiet the way people go quiet when they've stopped expecting to survive a day and then did anyway. I stood at the threshold a moment before crossing it. Black stone rising past where torchlight reached. air that smelled like something sealed shut a very long time. The inscription that had sent me here in the first place had promised a garden for the burden, and hell for the bastard who threw him away. I'd already built the garden. Standing in that doorway with 17 people at my back who wouldn't have made it through any other way, I understood the rest of it for the first time. The blessing was never the thing handed to the burden. It was what the burden did with it once nobody was watching to stop him. Silas was still out there somewhere, unarrested, protected for now by exactly the kind of paperwork that had almost kept every person behind me on the wrong side of this gate. Helena's people were still building whatever they were building. Serena still didn't know I was alive, and when she found out, that reckoning would come on its own day. Not this one. None of that was finished. I hadn't come here to finish it. I stepped through the gate into the black obsidian spire, and for once, I let myself feel exactly what that was worth instead of setting it aside for later the way I usually did. Whatever waited past this point, it was going to meet a man who had already stopped being anyone's burden to carry.